Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the July meeting of Swansea Ufo Network. The weather's been really great, so if you're interested in sky watches, keep an eye on our Facebook page, and the details will appear shortly. A few newcomers here. Just a reminder, our donations box is at the back of the room near the door. If you feel so inclined to support our meetings, your donation allows us to present to as many interested speakers that we can. Talking of which, tonight we welcome Dr. Dr Stubbings. Now, Daniel's been attending our meetings for quite some time and has been threatening to provide us with a talk, which I know is eagerly anticipated by many. So tonight is the night. It seems to me that Daniel has as many degrees as a thermometer. As you'll see now, I'll describe a little bit more about him. So Dr. Stubbings is a BA, Honours, Master of Psychology, PhD, PCLTHE, which is Postgraduate Certificate in Learning and Teaching in Higher Education, HCPC, which is the Health and Care Professions Council, C-Psychol, which is a Chartered Clinical Psychologist. Am I right, so far?
Yeah,
oh, good. AFBPSS, which is an Associate Fellow of the British Psychological Society. FHEA, which is the Fellowship of the Higher Education Academy, and a Registered Psychologist for the Australian Healthcare Professionals Regulation Agency. Right, he's the Principal Lecturer at Cardiff Metropolitan University on several degree programmes and has a growing portfolio of research that is expanding into the topic of unidentified anomalous phenomenon. He also works as a highly specialised psychologist in cancer and palliative care in the Morgannwg National Health Service. And prior to this, he spent 7 years working in secure mental health settings. He is a member of the Scientific Coalition for UAP and is currently networking with academics and experiences to apply his knowledge of the psychological sciences and psychotherapy to the UAP UFO issue. Now, tonight's talk will outline some of the recent unidentified aerial phenomena research in the field of psychology and some of the challenges facing the scientific community for this topic and the directions for future research. Right then, so while I've still got a little bit of breath left, will you please give a warm fond welcome to Dr. Dr Stubbings. Thank you.
Lovely. Well, nice to be back. Hopefully you can all hear me. I don't usually get nervous for public speaking because I do a lot of it in my teaching job, but I feel strangely nervous for this kind of crowd. Don't know why. I think there's an extra degree of pressure being the role that I have and the context and being in the public, but we'll see how it goes. Am I still too quiet? A lot closer. Is it? I'll just try and speak a bit louder then. I'm just saying basically how nervous I am, and that's very unusual for me.
Put it up a little bit, okay? It'll go up just a bit. There we go. That's probably better. There you go.
Happy days. Okay, so you've heard my background. What I'm going to do is get a bit of an overview from my background, the scientific process, a bit about the first study that we did, the second study that we did, and if I get time, I'm going to talk about some of the psychological reasons for the truth embargo and why that exists and why we may need to counter that, and then future directions for where I'm going to go with the research. So, yes, I'm a clinical psychologist, and that is different from a counsellor and it's different from a psychiatrist. So a psychiatrist is trained in medicine, and then they go on to do a bit of psychotherapy and usually administer medication for mental health issues. And then counsellors only usually have a few years training, and then they go on to do sometimes psychotherapy, but it's more broad. As Steve was saying, sort of my background, I did my bachelor's degree back home in Oz, and we cover a whole range of topics from statistical analysis to cognition to behaviour therapy to research methods, the history, addictions, yada yada yada. And then I did my honours degree, which is like a follow-up master's degree in the UK sort of equivalent. And then I did my master's PhD, and that's where I did my clinical training back home in Australia. I was mostly trained in cognitive behaviour therapy, which was the sort of standard model of the time, but over the years I've managed to learn a lot more about psychodynamic, existential, humanistic and interpersonal kind of approaches to therapy. But I won't bore you too much with that. So yeah, after I graduated in 2012 back in Oz, I then spent a year working in remote rural Australia, and then 2013, after a decade of study. I was itching to kind of see the world and had a British passport. So I came over here and got married, and now I'm here for life. But when I got here, I started working with severe mental health issues in secure settings. So I've pretty much seen it all through those environments, whether it's kind of severe hallucinations or psychosis, people with severe personality disorders that are great risk to themselves and others. I've worked with pedophiles, I've worked with the victims, and kind of everything sort of in between in terms of their forensic histories, their kind of severe trauma histories. There's pretty much, I've become unshockable in the context of that work. But I did that for long enough and got the badge, got the t-shirt, and now I'm kind of on to something I enjoy in a different kind of way, which is cancer and palliative care. So I've spent the last 3 years working in cancer and palliative care, running a service in Cwmtaf for that. 2016 I began working at Cardiff Metropolitan University and sort of worked my way back into academia, because once you're sort of there you kind of miss it after a while, and it's good to be a scientist practitioner. And then basically, the reason that's all important is that's part of my indoctrination and history that didn't include this topic of UAP and UFO stuff. So it really wasn't until 2020 that I had no interest in this topic. I was taught through and through that there was so many prosaic explanations for this stuff, we don't need to focus on it, there's so many other ways to explain it. I'm not materialist focused, but I was a materialist in the sense that unless you can see it and touch it, it really doesn't exist. I kind of scoffed my head at parapsychology and that whole realm. It's the way I was taught in the context of academia, that a lot of it just we shouldn't even bother with. And so, yeah, I see it as 2020, a mate said, "Oh, have you seen this guy called Bob Lazar?" And I was like, "Well, no, and why would I?" And he's like, "Well, you might think it's rather interesting." So I watched it and I was like, okay, I've seen every kind of mental health issue that you could imagine. And then I see somebody who doesn't look like they're hallucinating. I'm not saying I believe Bob Lazar or not Bob Lazar. I'm just saying he came across as relatively credible when I was sort of new to the field, thinking, okay, this guy doesn't seem insane. He seems well enough. And but he had some pretty insane things to say. And so that kind of started scratching the itch. And as many of you might find, once you start looking into this topic, you start looking more and more and more, and then you don't really stop. But the Bob Lazar was really kind of got me onto, well, why are people taking this so seriously? And that's what got me onto the 2017 New York Times article. And I was like, that's where I was introduced to Lou Elizondo and everything, and TTSA and everything that unfolded in relation to that. And then you've got the UAP task force reports, the first one, the second one, the National Defense Appropriations Act bills in America, where there's been multiple ones of those, and each time they're looking for more and more things that seem far, far more credible. The two congressional hearings, then people like David Grush coming forward, all the works by Ross Coulthart and Christopher Mellon, and that UFO podcast, and the Theories of Everything, the Need to Know podcast, etc., etc. Many of you are familiar with this stuff. And so the more I delved into it, the more I was like, well, this is a lot of accounts, this is a lot of people. I mean, there's no other topic I'm aware of that has an equal amount of so-called rubbish and is a bona fide topic. How can there be so much stuff that is false when actually maybe it's not false? Like, it's sort of, there's no, if it's an aberrant kind of prosaic thing that's happening with human beings, why isn't there other groups getting together around the belief about Dumbo, or that maybe Santa Claus really is real? I mean, maybe that's because those things don't exist, and maybe some people have had some real experiences with whatever this is. And so it just intrigued me more and more and more to think some people are taking this really, really seriously. I mean, I've kind of looked into the NIDS investigations, and that cow there is one where they describe from the time on Skinwalker Ranch where they looked right close at the cuts on the cow, and even the hairs are cut. Like, what is cutting a cow in the middle of a field with no blood and doing those kinds of incisions? Like, it ain't the farmers, they're not going to be killing their own cows. Like, no animal does that, and they certainly can't cut the hairs. And so it's things like that that make me go, And then reading Graham Rendell's work and Robert Hastings, the UFO nukes, the skinwalkers at the Pentagon, Witness to Roswell and Timothy Good's Beyond Top Secret, and looking at some of the crop circles. Now, I don't know if crop circles are real or not, but some of them I've seen on YouTube in high definition look really interesting. And you put all these things together, it's like there's clearly, to me, something there, and the balance is almost to prove that there's nothing there. That is almost the harder mountain to climb with the amount of stuff that seems there. And there's some good documentaries like the Aerial documentary and Moment of Contact and The Phenomenon. And so, all this stuff kind of left me with thinking, well, this is either the largest global military display of incompetence ever witnessed. Seagulls, balloons, travelling puppet shows and drunken fighter jets are taking over the world. Maybe that's possibility one. Possibility two, maybe there is some human tech that we're pretending is from somewhere else. But why would you bother doing that? If it's easy enough, it seems to be, to create wars and get lots of money for military organizations. So you don't need to make this pretend UFO thing to get more money for military. That doesn't really make much sense. And if you want to convince your adversaries that you've got better tech, well, just don't tell them anything. I mean, so possibility 1 and 2 does not make sense to me. Okay, so is it possibly number 3, that UAP and this non-human intelligence might be real? And so with that possibility in mind, that's where I've started trying to think, well, how can I help in this area? Because if we're not alone, just on the balance of probabilities, you'd almost think that we could be based on the size of the universe, but on what most people experience, it seems like we're alone. But it seems like there's a proportion of the population who have had experiences that look otherwise. And if that is the case, you know, when I'm old, I really do want to be able to tell my kids that I had the courage to look into this. And if people like David Grush are saying they have interviewed the people behind closed doors with first-hand experience working with these things, he's not paid to lie. He's going to go to jail if he's lying. Yeah, I think it's up to 5 years. I think Ross Coulthart said 10 years. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but he's either going to get fined or go to jail if he's lying. And he's told multiple committees that he's talked to many first-hand witnesses, and he's provided that evidence to Congress, the Inspector General. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty serious allegations from some people that this is all real. And if it is, I want to be able to tell my kids that I've had the courage to look at this. The other reason I'm looking at it is because over the years I've become Dr. Unshockable, in that the only people who are exposed to, I'd say, worse stuff than me are the people who actually hunt pedophiles and have to watch the videos for criminal cases. Because I deal with, particularly with the severe trauma stuff, I'm helping them with the trauma, work through the incidents, and it's like a movie in my mind that I can see as I'm working with them. So, okay, maybe I've not seen the same horrific things that they've seen, but I'm certainly imagining it working alongside them. And eventually you develop some resilience. And it's the same with working in cancer and palliative care. And I've watched many people die. I've helped people try and become at peace before they die. So it's kind of, and I don't usually, 99.9% of the time, I don't find it that upsetting. It's my job and I enjoy it and it's a privilege to be there. So if anyone can kind of work with this kind of nature stuff, I'm open to it. The other thing is, if in life, if you pursue anything with a degree of depth, then some argue that the voice and call of what is sacred becomes manifest in you. That anything you do in life, you should really give it your all, in other words, because that's actually where you find most joy in life and most meaning and direction, is when you really throw yourself into a topic. And that's part of the addiction to this topic as well, because once you start staring at the sun, so to speak, you can't stop looking at it when it comes to this topic. And maybe that's an important thing. Maybe we do need to look at this with a degree of depth. And if this stuff is all true and it's not some prosaic kind of aberration of mistakes, then there will be no more profound topic in our time of this issue. So how can it not be exciting? Even if we prove that it's all bollocks. That's exciting because that's a massive scientific challenge. How do we get the millions and millions of people to prove that kind of actually what they were seeing was not actually the case? How do we prove that David Grush is lying? If we could do that, that is a monumental feat of human science. But so is the alternative, that it's all actually, not all, but some of it could be genuinely real. So, where the hell do I start? So first off, my first protocol was trying to humble myself with my lack of knowledge in this area. I was indoctrinated against this topic. I've partial to the usual stigma that many have had before this, so I've tried to read as much as I can over the last couple of years. The other thing I think might be important to sort of start off is that I don't know if this is the right thing or wrong thing to do, but I do feel the need to apologise on behalf of my profession to some extent, that the psychological sciences and mental health treatment have mostly overlooked people who have been exposed to UAP stuff. Now, you could say, well, I know in some health boards there's no mental health treatment for those that have cancer. Okay, so that's a resource issue. So it's not necessarily all my fault that there isn't a treatment service for people who are struggling with being exposed to UAP. But I guess what I'm sort of saying is, if anyone was charged to looking to understand what people experience, it would be the psychological sciences. And it has completely neglected this area on average. Now, I'll go over a few people that haven't neglected this area. And yes, there are some counsellors and there are some psychologists out there that do try and treat in this area, but you're not going to really find it in the scientific literature on how to actually do this stuff and how we should approach it in an ethical kind of way. There's not many research studies on it, and there's almost none that are done from a believer point of view. It's usually, how can we disprove an account? So I guess for what it's worth, I think it might be important to apologise that we don't have a body of help in this area. The other step is to review what's been done before and then take very tiny little small steps. Now, as much as we like to think of science being massive leaps of change, actually you find it's very small steps, and that's how science is done. It's little by little, which is why it takes a heck of a long time. Now, I've seen a few people kind of talk about science as though the scientific method can't really address this problem of UAP and what it is. And I disagree with that, because I think it's just the way some people are using the scientific method, and it's the questions we're asking. Ask better questions, do better science. There's nothing wrong with the scientific method, it's just how we apply it. And anyone who thinks that science is the problem may not understand enough about how science should work. And is there lots of bad science done around the world? Yes. Are there lots of bad scientists who ask lots of poor questions? Yes. Am I perfect as a scientist? No. But the scientific method of inquiry and asking questions and freedom of thought to figure out what's going on, there isn't a problem with that. So the levels of science should be, the lowest level is the descriptive exploratory research. Now, that's, when I say lowest, that doesn't mean worse, it just means it's exploratory. We're kind of looking at a problem. So, and that's kind of where I'm sort of beginning, is, for example, what proportion of people report a UAP sighting, which we'll get to in the second half of the talk. What prevents people from reporting their sightings? Also, I'll talk about that in the second half. What impact does having a UAP sighting have on somebody? Do experiences have unmet psychological and social needs? You know, is there something kind of going on there? Then you've also got correlational and regression research, which is, does A predict B on a statistical kind of basis? So what's the statistical relationship between a belief in UAP and one's personality dynamics? Is there a link? Is it a certain kind of person who believes and sees things? And I'll go over what I found in the second study on that. Then you've got observational hypothesis-driven testing, which is another layer of scientific kind of investigation. So this is where you may look at, is one group statistically different from another? And then you have a hypothesis that they aren't, and then you use statistical techniques to test, is one group different from another? And then you establish, based on probability to a 99.9%, that one group is different from the other, and that's a hypothesis-driven. And then you've got experimental conditions, which is where maybe we get you group doing CE5, you guys just meditating in a field or doing Wim Hof, and then we send you off on your way and we see who makes sightings and who doesn't. Maybe it's just a matter of being there under the sky. So that would be an experimental design. And ideally, we'd blindfold you or kind of have a blind trial in some kind of way. So yeah, that's how different levels of research kind of sort of should work. And it's small incremental steps along that with repeatable experiments. Now, yes, a lot of the UFO stuff is not repeatable in the sense that some people who report two people taking a picture of a UFO and they did different pictures. One has a picture, one doesn't, another one has a different one. Yes, the people say that they see them change shapes and yada yada. There is an issue about repeatability, but so there is in lots of kind of experiments. Then we conduct systematic reviews, which is basically you review all the literature out there and you piece it together and then have some informed discussion from there. And then the next level of science beyond that is a meta-analysis, where you get all the experimental studies together and you do a statistical analysis on the studies themselves. And that's a meta-analysis, and that's the best form of evidence that we can ever have. So good science is a slow process with small leaps. Now, the issue around the UFO thing, why it needs such a high bar to sort of say that there is something there can be understood in the context of signal detection theory. So apply this to cancer. So a hit is you have cancer. So you go through an MRI, they scan you, and it comes up as cancer. Okay, useful, right? It's also useful if the scanner comes up and says, you don't have cancer, there's no cancer there. Also useful. It is a problem if there's a false alarm where we say you have cancer and actually you don't. It's also a problem if we say you don't have cancer, but you do. Now, you kind of want that balance to be right when it comes to cancer diagnosis. You want a high bar of certainty that it is there, but you don't want that bar so high that they're probably going to miss it until you're almost dead. And it's the same thing with UFOs, with the whole topic. Either we are not alone, which is a hit, or we are alone, which is a correct rejection. We don't want the other two, where we say there is a non-human intelligence and there isn't, because that's a problem, because there's consequences. And it's also a problem if we say there isn't and there is. So there's a really high scientific bar for saying that we're not alone. And maybe we've reached that threshold with David Grush. I don't know. It's not like I've interviewed him or spoken to his kind of witnesses, but it's just recognizing that the consequences could be massive. Then the other problem is, how am I going to fit this into my work? So it's like I have 2 days in the NHS and I have a caseload of about 60 patients, and there's another 30 I supervise. I supervise a trainee clinical psychologist. I do the risk-reducing mastectomy assessments, and then I do all the consultation, reflective practice for all the other clinicians that work in that area. And in the university, I teach clinical psychology in undergraduate. I teach applied psychology in the postgraduate. I have 3 thesis students. I have 5 to 7 varies master's thesis students a year. I have a PhD student. And I'm working on establishing a clinic where I'm hoping to nest the UFO stuff into, but a broader clinic at the university I'm setting up. So I don't have that, and I've got a family, so I don't have that much time. So I've got to figure out ways that I can kind of do UAP research in the stuff that I've already got. Now, I can't do that on the NHS side, but I could maybe do that in the student projects, and that's where I've kind of begun with the research, is trying to make a project that I can do alongside some of the students and then testing it from there. The other challenges on my side of the fence are the risk to the university's reputation. I mean, this is the first time I've kind of been public with a badge that says I'm from Cardiff Metropolitan University, because I know the projects that I've done and the data I have is an ethically approved project. But I can't come out and say things beyond what I've done with the data, because I'm also representing a university and I have to try and not embarrass the university. And let's face it, this topic is embarrassing for the university on average, because there's so much stigma associated with it. So I have to try and tread carefully where I can with this and try and put forward that, like Gary Nolan says, let the data speak for itself. I also have no money. No one's paying me to do any of this, so that's a problem. Finding credible witnesses, there's a lot more out there than one would kind of think, but there's also lots of uncredible ones, and how I sort of sift through that's an issue. There's also a risk to student researchers, so they may or may not be able to handle this kind of topic, so I can't always give it to just any student. Fitting it around work commitments. And then there's a risk to the participants. What if I come across somebody who's actually really psychotic, unwell, self-harming? I need to be able to refer them on to somewhere. You know, I've got to make sure the public's safe as well. So with those caveats and challenges in mind, what has been done before? So not a lot. The biggest study that I came across was the FREE study. I can't remember what the FREE stands for, though. It's an acronym. They had over 3,000 participants, 500 odd questions, and it was mostly descriptive statistics about UFOs and what they've seen and what they've experienced. 70% said it was a positive experience for them in the long term. The people said yes to having experiences of telepathy and out-of-body experiences and all kinds of stuff that's in the paranormal. And some have had sightings, some were physical, non-physical. If you type in the free study, you can find it in the Journal of Scientific Exploration as the published paper, and then the full works you can find through their authors. And then most of you probably know about John Mack, who was a psychiatrist, so he wasn't a psychological scientist. There's a difference. So to be a psychologist, you have to be a scientist first and then a psychologist. But he was sort of one of the first to really, along with Bud Hopkins and others, to do look at abductees and really sort of see their accounts and go, well, these people do seem emotionally well and they don't fit in the usual realms of mental health. And there's something kind of very interesting here. There's another psychologist, I can't remember their first name, but McNally's the second name, and they wrote a book that was kind of in response to John's work, where it was kind of going through all the prosaic explanations of why abductions and sightings could be something else and could be explained in different ways. Now, I'm not interested in the prosaic explanations. Other people can do that. I've got more interesting things. I'm interested in if this stuff is true. Christopher French is at Goldsmith University, and again, he's a respected professor of psychology who's been looking into this topic for quite some, but almost all of his work has been within a debunking kind of prosaic explanations, grounded in good psychological theory and good psychological experiments sort of showing why sightings could be something prosaic and terrestrial. Okay, great, good for them. The next study that's more recent was Yingling, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but I've had a chat to these authors and we're hoping to see if we can kind of do some copycat work in the UK. But recently they published a paper looking at faculty members of universities and their perceptions of this topic. Do they know about it? What have they heard? What haven't they heard? About 1/5 of those academics reported their own UAP sightings. 63% felt it was very to absolutely essential that academia is involved in this topic, so they did see it as important. 32% increased their interest in the topic slightly after they showed them the New York Times articles and some of the stuff that had been coming out. But only about 3% were like, oh my God, this is amazing stuff and I need to look into this more. So even when you provide them all the stuff that's currently out there, people are still a little bit, on average, not that kind of captivated by it. But there are a small group that have. But a good majority think, yes, science needs to look into this. Now, there's another study, well, it's not a study, it's kind of a discussion piece, really, by Rabion, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. They are from a clinic in France that is providing treatment for people who have had paranormal experiences, and they include abduction experiences. And in the Frontiers of Psychology journal, it's a paper called When the Truth is Out There, counselling people who report anomalous experiences. And they basically are providing a psychological model or framework around the areas of knowledge you should have when working with this population. So I won't go too much into the details of their model, but basically there are some thinking in the directions around how do we work with this population. You've also got to think about the complexities between how UAP experiences might link to mental health issues. So some people might have a UAP exposure or sighting, and then they develop post-traumatic stress disorder or depression, so they have a mental health issue, maybe addiction, that emerges after a sighting. Maybe for some people, they get traumatized or raped, or they have depression or hard times, and then they have a UAP experience. Now, does that mean that those hard times led to the perception of that, or was those hard times what encouraged them over for a sighting? Don't know. It could be sometimes people have mental health issues, whether it's psychosis, and they misperceive something as a UAP when it wasn't. It could be that a UAP happened to be around while some event was occurring in their life, and the two are uncorrelated. They just co-occurred at the same time but have nothing to do with one another. It could be some intense form of meditation leading to some cosmic connection, however you want to define it. There could be other people who are flat out malingering. I mean, I've worked with psychopaths that I buy volcano insurance from because they're just so convincing. So there are people like that out there that would do this for money. They would do it just for a laugh, and would do it to wind up people. I've even worked with people who harm their own children for attention. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that people would use this topic to, I saw a UFO and that's why I crashed my car. You know, it's going to happen the more this kind of comes out there and is something people can jump on. False memories can also lead to a belief in UAP. So lots of people do actually go to jail and prison on testimony that is based on false memory, and it is an issue. There's so many ways that a false memory can occur. So it's not just a case of, are people who have sightings ill or not ill, because there's so many ways this can all interlink. So basically, from what I've found, there is no psychological science from a believer point of view. And I use that kind of loosely, or someone who's attempting to look into this topic from the possibility it might be real. And in some ways, rightly so. I mean, there's so many other things this could be. We do need to tick them off. It's a bit like saying, well, I've got a lump in my breast. Oh, you've got cancer. Well, maybe it's something else. Maybe they need to look into that before you diagnose cancer. And so maybe it's the same with this topic. We need to have a seriously good look at what else it could be. And let's face it, we've been doing that for a long time. So the more interesting thing is, what is the other box it could be? There's been many case studies, and there's lots of different authors that have kind of provided a case study, and I don't see any real reason why they would make up a case. If you wanted to make an interesting read, you probably could make it about a different topic. So, but those case studies, I don't know that data. Even if I read it, it doesn't mean I can verify it. So, I mean, the past data doesn't mean we should ignore it, and we should look at it. But it's not something I can really try and publish in a scientific journal. I can't show the methodology of how I obtained it. I can't give it to another researcher and say, could you look over these transcripts, give it your own independent analysis, and then let's see what happens. But that's, you could in theory set that up with the community, but it's just a bit hard. So this is where it kind of got me as the first project. I thought, okay, why don't we look at what are the unmet needs of experiencers? And experiencers in the broader term, some people want to call them witnesses, some people want to call them abductees, whatever, just that's the word I'm using for now. So could there be a group of people in society who have unmet needs? And it's not about questioning their account, not about sort of saying, well, was it this, was it that, or were you mistaken, or yada, yada, yada. I don't want to touch that. This project was just look at, let's see what you need without any prejudgment about what we think you've experienced. And how does it fit in the context of their life? So what I did was semi-structured interviews. So I've got a list of questions that I went through, and I kind of wing my interviews. It's been enough years that I kind of wing it, but I've got a guide of where I need to go through the interview questions. And then I got the student to do it because this was a student project, but I had to do the interviews just for ethics. And then they transcribed it, the sort of 2-hour interviews, sitting there laboriously kind of coding it all. And so a thematic analysis is where you look at what we call qualitative data, which is usually transcripts of interviews, and then we code it for stuff that's in there. So if they talk about feeling sad at one moment, we'll highlight that and identify that as sad. Or if they're talking about how it impacted family, we just highlight that and put it in a box. And we kind of label every little bit of the transcript, sometimes multiple times, to sort of code it. And then with that coding, you stand back and you look, okay, well, what kind of buckets does this sort of fit into, or topics? And so then you kind of put them into topics, then you look back at the data and the coding and you recode it, and then you go back and you start seeing these themes emerge, this content that comes out of the data. And then, we collaborated to make sure we were kind of on the same page. I know it's a bit small, you probably can't see it from there, but these are the questions that I kind of guided myself on. So, like, when you first began experiencing the phenomena, how did you react emotionally? Just give them the floor to talk about that. Or have you had any positive experiences? What were your negative experiences? At this point in your life, can you think of any help you might need or want to receive in relation to the phenomenon? These kinds of things. It's about how they've experienced their journey and what they think they need. Now, it's a little rough summary on there, but I should be able to see it from here. So I had 4 participants. Well, I actually had 6, and I lost 2 of them because I made a screw up with my data collection and using the record thing. It's my fault. It wasn't a phenomenon. It was my screw up. But I was absolutely gutted because their testimony was incredible. And I've still got the case notes, but it's not the same as being able to transcribe for detail everything that transpired in that. But what I found in the other 4 participants, I think will overlay quite well to the other 2 that I couldn't include in the analysis. Now I'll try not to read it all, so we kind of sort of on time. But participant 1, so this was somebody, if I can see it right. She was basically in her 50s, several children, multiple grandchildren. She reported being someone who struggled to engage in work throughout her life. She's mostly been a mum. She first reported that she began having paranormal experiences in childhood, seeing things move independently and seeing people after they died. Then at the age of 7, she recalled an object in the sky shaped like an acorn. Age 13, she saw smaller glowing orbs moving alongside one another. The major UAP incident was in the 90s in a rural part of the UK. I've anonymised a lot of this stuff, and I've kind of been vague about the location, so you can't identify exactly who, so yeah, for confidentiality. So in this major experience, where was I? So it lasted for about 4 hours, the experience, and it included beings on the ground, missing time. Since then, she's had encounters with what she believes to be non-human entities. So some were like the Greys, some were more reptilian. She's also had other experiences like being pinned down in the bed, waking up with bruises, burns on her body. One occasion within the last decade, she'd got the feeling that the entities were in her house, and she became really verbally offensive to them to get out, and they did from her point of view. On one incident they were there, and she reported having telepathic communication with them, and they gave her lots of information about what they're up to. What else? Okay, that was participant 2. Participant 1, sorry. Participant 2. So this was a man in his 50s, and he worked as a project manager. He had a background in engineering. He came from a large family. He had no specific kind of developmental traumas that he talked about. But 2020, he had a heart attack, and approximately a year later, he started. This is the draft of the paper that I'm working on to try and present all this. That's where I'm getting it from. And so basically, a year after he had a heart attack, he started seeing these strange silver objects in the sky, a bit like a mirror, he said. They were high up in the sky, being reflected back at him. And on one occasion, he saw a floating craft that was about 50 foot away from him in broad daylight. Moments later, he saw a metallic sphere that was floating about 10 to 15 feet above his head. And in the months afterwards, he saw numerous anomalous objects and what looked like to be terrestrial objects, such as drones as well. On one occasion, he was going for a walk in a populated city, and a beam of light surrounding his body came down from above. On another occasion, he saw a humanoid figure that was kind of blacked out with tiny pinpricks of light coming through, and it was floating outside his bedroom. He reported that there had been times when him and his partner had woken up with strange injuries that neither of them could explain. And he recalls waking up with cuts on his wrists and his ankles and bruises and a gash on his head and bloody nose and ears, blisters, that kind of thing. Participant 3, he was in his 40s. He was in a long-term relationship with his children and had several children. He'd experienced numerous adverse childhood experiences, so he kind of fitted the profile of a traumatic childhood and then going on to UAP experiences. And that doesn't mean that UAP experiences are caused by trauma, but it's just, it kind of fits that sort of narrative. And he basically learned to cope with his challenges by being really busy in life. So this is a very productive guy that had worked in lots of different kinds of jobs. And then in 2014, his daughter reported some strange lights outside his house, and he didn't think much of it. And then in the early hours of the morning, he saw a flash of light in the sky and then saw 2 balls of white light that were about 100 feet off the ground, moving suddenly, but then shot off at incredible speed. He then went back outside and saw what he described as the most beautiful object about the size of a truck, luminous golden plasma. Oh, he assumed it was plasma, he didn't know, but it's that kind of look, in the shape of a diamond. A feeling of joy, love and awe came over him, that seemed incongruent with the situation. The ontological shock and the confusion set in, and once the object moved away, he later realized that despite only observing it for 2 or 3 minutes, there was about 30 minutes of missing time. And the object came back in subsequent nights and was witnessed by one of the other observers in the household. Later that year, he experienced a frightening paranormal event where really distinct footsteps were kind of very, very close by him and his partner. And on another occasion, his infant son was kind of asleep on the sofa, and then it kind of like the child sort of woke up abruptly, and he went over to comfort him. But at that moment, he saw to his periphery, as he looked into the doorway, there was this something. He didn't have words for it. There was something there. It was like some sort of shadowy figure, but he didn't want to say it was quite like a shadow. It was about 3 to 4 foot tall, and it was leaning into the room, and then it proceeded to sort of glide across and away from the room. The following day, he saw a cylindrical object in a clear sky, and the morning after, he reported an incident of sleep paralysis. But he was hesitant. He said, it felt like sleep paralysis, and I don't think it was to do with the phenomenon, but he doesn't know. Where was I? In the years that followed, there was other poltergeist activities, such as doors moving on their own, handles moving erratically, and he began seeing other kind of smaller UAP. His neighbour also had been experiencing similar paranormal events around the same time his first contact began. And he'd seen, 2017, a metallic dark sphere in broad daylight for about 20 minutes that was witnessed with another person in his household. And then participant 4, so this was another guy in his 40s. He'd began seeing UAP in childhood, and he had family, works in the computer industry, so he's employed. His childhood was a mix of challenging experiences and loving ones, as a lot of our lives are. And at the age of 5, alongside another observer, he recalls seeing a triangle formation of green lights that were rotating along with a pair of flashing lights that rapidly. And after gaining some attention of the adults, they dismissed it. Nightmares started beginning after that, and where he'd be sort of laid out kind of flat on a cold surface, and this tall white human-looking thing in a gown with blue unblinking eyes was sort of walking towards him. And there was an adult on a table next to him that was just had tubes coming out of him. In the dream, he remembers being moved via levitation down corridors, and he's open that he was, I don't know if it's a dream, if it's something that happened, if it was a memory, but he experiences it as a dream. That with all the other things in his life, it seemed a bit strange for him. So what else? And then in junior high school, he had his first daytime sighting of UAP, and others in the school started calling out that they could see a spaceship, and he described seeing a large UAP in broad daylight, and then these military planes kind of flew on after it. And the teachers didn't believe him. And in early adulthood, he then had some paranormal experiences in which he described his wrists being grabbed in bed, and it made him sort of shoot up in bed in fear. Posters flying off the walls, other sort of paranormal kind of activity. Then the next major sighting was in his 30s when he was at work, and he was looking out his office window, and there was this massive metal gun grey cylinder that moved out of the clouds at a 45-degree angle. It was rotating with the sunlight glinting off it, and then it straightened up vertical while descending. And he estimated it to be about 200, 300 sort of foot long, with about 50 feet wide. And it continued to descend and then stopped, and then slowly ascended back into the clouds again. And he was left shaking and didn't sleep for many days following that. Then he's had other times with driving with family where he's seen 2 black triangles. There's been other incidents that he's had. I'm trying to skim read, so don't take up too much of your time. And he's had other witnesses see these things alongside him. There was one really bizarre paranormal event where there was a disguised robotic voice that was coming through his partner's voice, the phone, that was of his voice talking to somebody. And again, so many of these cases have paranormal events linked to their experiences. And so you kind of get the picture. There's been a range of kinds of experiences. Now, so after getting ethical approval to do the study and getting the participants, this is what I found. So these are the themes. So I'll try not to read them through verbatim. Yeah, you can see them from there. So basically, what you do in thematic analysis is you ask kind of a question. So what was the effect of this UAP exposure on these people? So it comes down to the psychological reactions, the social impact, and then other. There's like another box. So in terms of theme 1, so the ontological shock. So let me put that, okay, because I'll read out some of what people had to say. So participants, and this is unsurprising, but participants felt that their worldview had shifted. Everything they knew or the foundation about their world had changed. And this evoked questions about life, their existence, and their place in the universe. So this is a direct quote. This is my view, just man's position in the universe. I know there are other things out there. As where others said, you just start to psychologically disintegrate because it takes away everything you thought you knew, and it doesn't take it away overnight. It takes it away in 1 second. Another participant said it made me explore other concepts, like where are we from, why are we here, where do we go from here, these burning questions kind of came into my head, and it's like what happens when we die. Another one talked about, he basically went to go see a priest because he was just so shocked at what he'd sort of seen that he just had nowhere to place it. So that's the ontological shock, which makes sense. Then there's the anxiety. So one said, I immediately felt sick, immediately nauseous, very, very nauseous. I felt dizzy. I felt as if I should sit down. I couldn't breathe. I had to control my breathing. Another said, I've never felt fear like that. I just wanted to get in my car and just go home, be with my family. Another said, I was on duty all night because I wanted to protect my son. I thought I could protect him. So I got weapons and I started taking stimulants just because I wanted to stay awake all night to protect him. So this fear was really, really real for them. Then there's the anger. This didn't always come out in participants, but there's one clear example where one of the participants said, I was saying to this space, look, I know you're there. I can feel you. Why are you hiding from me? I'm a single mum with little kids, you chicken, bleep, bleep. You're ruining my life. You've come for me. Now my kids, I've had enough. Another said, it made me mad because I felt like I was being tested. So this is an example where there's only a few quotes about anger, but a thematic analysis, you're kind of looking at the data and the transcripts and trying to pull out which bits seem to be an issue, and anger seemed to be there from my point of view. The other thing was paradoxical reactions. So one said, instead of feeling scared, I was almost like it was put upon me, this feeling of joyous, kind love. Another said, I just carried on walking. I probably had headphones on, just listening to some podcast or something. And even though I was probably munching it over in my head, there was kind of this normality about it. So some of them they all described anxiety at some point, but many of them had these other reactions where it seemed like they would get this joyous love feeling that was strange, or this kind of whatever, there's a 50-foot massive craft up there. Okay, carry on. Maybe we live in a desensitized society and maybe that's the case. Or maybe something else is going on. I don't know, but it's part of what was there. Another said, whoever they are, I get a bit of comfort from that. I get lifted up. So it seems like a deliberate thing to give me a boost. And so you could say that's just a post hoc justification around anxiety, and you find many people who have been traumatized or abused and they start making up reasons why the abuser or the aggressor kind of did what they did and how it's okay and stuff. So you could argue that it's post hoc justifications, but I'm not trying to do that level of analysis. I'm just trying to look at what themes are kind of coming through, and paradoxical reactions seems to be a theme. Another thing was isolation. So one said, it puts you on your own completely, so you are totally isolated. Another said, I think the overarching thing I get from all this is the isolation. It's a feeling that you're on your own with it. Another said, I asked them all about how you could talk to your employer or friends about it, and one said, no, I just wouldn't. I wouldn't be believed. They'd be like, are you serious? Are you ridiculous? You just wouldn't be believed. If I phoned in work and said I've had a UFO sighting and I haven't slept for nights, I dread to think what response would be, I just wouldn't risk my job over it. And so one of the themes that I noticed, one of the psychological reactions from people who have seen UAP, this doesn't mean everyone experiences these same things, but it's something that came out, was a deep, profound sense of isolation and loneliness, which, okay, many people do have friends and things, but most people on average may roll their eyes, or they may have a compassionate sense of interest, but on average this is a heavily stigmatized topic, even amongst, I've been looking at this stuff for the last couple of years and doing projects on it, and even my wife's not that interested. Even the people closest to us are a bit like, is it going to pay the bills? Is it going to do the washing? No, okay, fine. So for the people who have had these experiences, real or not real, that's not necessarily as relevant. It's for them deeply isolating to not be able to talk about it. And you'd find lots of similarities between all the Jimmy Savile victims. Many of them probably felt isolated, couldn't talk about it. And now they're all talking about it, and wow, it seems to be a thing. So yeah, isolation's a factor. So let's look at the green side. Let's look at the social impact. So along with that isolation is denial from others. I mean, some said, look, yeah, I've tried to tell my dad, and he just couldn't even go there. He just brushed it off. He said, don't be silly. People see all kinds of stuff in the sky. It's just lights. So I won't go over that one too much. Judgment as well. Some people said, your family think you're mad, your friends think you're mad. That's it. Another one said, look, I remember thinking, I'm going to do this. I'm going to get myself tested by some mental health professional because people are going to question my sanity if I don't. Another one said, a friend said to him, if you ever tell people what happened, don't tell them that weird stuff. Just tell them the bit where your girlfriend saw it with you and leave it at that, because otherwise people think you're nuts. And so this judgment from others. So when you put together the denial, the judgment from others, the isolation, it's not surprising it leads to a degree of relationship strain. So, excuse me, many of them felt that they think they can cope with the trauma, or their partners can cope with what they have to say about it, but actually many of them can't. And it ends up traumatizing them once they start thinking about this stuff. Others said that they definitely feel like it caused problems between them and their wife. They said, whenever I've had a breakdown in a relationship or in my life, they just give me quetiapine, which is an antipsychotic. And I don't want that. I don't want to lose touch with what I'm experiencing. I want to deal with it. The other theme seems to be a lack of external help. Some were offered, they said, I was offered Valium, temazepam, whatever I could kind of get through the doctors. Sometimes it was kind of, they developed, one person developed a drug addiction following exposure. Now, those kinds of examples, it would be the old me before the UAP study stuff would say, well, they've had all these drug experiences, that's probably false memory. But I don't have the arrogance to say that anymore, that it's very also probable, based on what David Grush is saying, that maybe they had a profound experience that was traumatizing and shocking, and they cope with that through drugs. You know, it would be so unethical and unkind for a rape victim to say, well, oh, you developed a drug problem afterwards, therefore we don't really believe your testimony. That wouldn't fly, because we kind of are on the basis that what they're accounting has some degree of truth in it. Just like when you go over the Michael Jackson allegations, there's proven inconsistencies in the victim's stories, but that is the nature of trauma memories. That trauma memories memory is not a reflection of reality, it's all a construction in one's mind. So trauma memories are never accurate, but often the gist can be very, very accurate. Yeah, so there's a lack of external help. There's nowhere to go to. And yes, there are some support groups. There's places like here, and there's places that actually do experience the support groups, and there's quite a few in America. But there is nowhere legitimate, endorsed by, say, the UK or a health body, that says, this is where to go for further sources of information about this. This is where to go for guidance. And when we do go for guidance, often it's to maybe UFO Twitter and other social media. And we know that's a bit of a rat's nest. Everybody's fighting everybody. It's social media. It's designed, the AI algorithms want us to fight each other and argue. So you go on all of these platforms and basically you see lots of people arguing and fighting with others. That, you know, the aliens are here to save us, and others saying, well, it's all nothing, and all this sort of infighting. And it's kind of like, what if you were somebody vulnerable, scared, confused, and you're looking to those kinds of sources for help? I mean, you're just as likely to get somebody saying that it's all love and light in the Stephen Greer kind of camp as you are the people saying that it's all out to get us, and other people saying, no, it's all made up in your head. So there's no guiding body or ethical standards of which people who have been exposed to this stuff, particularly for the first time, have got anywhere to go. So that leads me to the other impacts. So they all had paranormal experiences. Yeah, I won't go into that too much because I'm going on a bit. And the experiences with the UAP community, they all had good and bad experiences. Some made friends, some didn't, and some a bit of both. Some have run into some nasty characters and vice versa. So again, there's this issue of what effect has UAP exposure had, and I can summarize that by there are psychological impacts from exposure and there are social impacts. So this all leads us, well, what unmet needs do people have as a result of all this? And so the first one that seemed to come out from the data was external validation. Every single one of them, the look of relief on their face when they could say there was somebody else that saw an incident with them, it's just like, oh, thank God. Because they just weren't as alone with the problem, because somebody else saw it with them. And so part of what many people have wanted is, if this stuff is real, it would be nice if they came out. Like, we don't need to know how we make a nuclear bomb, but we know that nuclear bombs are real and they can be set off. If this stuff is true, it'd be nice if there's an acknowledgement that it is true, we do have this stuff, but you're not going to get to play with it. Yeah, that would be frustrating, but as long as the right people get to play with it in science, great. But that external validation would go a long way to easing the emotional burden and the isolation, because you've got something to really combat the stigma. I think we're starting to get some of that with some of the allegations and witnesses that have come forward in the congressional hearings. It is part of why I can say at the university, this is really important. The US Congress are taking this very seriously. The Canadian documents look like the UK is involved as well. We should look into this. It becomes harder to say no, but it is a really important area for experiences from what I can tell. Non-judgmental listening. So that's the other bit, is kind of, which any decent health professional should be able to do, but it's coming at it with the ability to really listen to their accounts and how they have to tell them, because like the witness that was saying, it was a shadowy figure with pinholes of light coming through them. You need the freedom and the emotional interpersonal safety to be able to say what doesn't have words really, and then finding a way to communicate that. And so that's an area where they reported needing something. And person-centered individual professional formulations. So you need someone who can maybe help formulate, how does the drug addiction that you developed fit in with the UAP experiences? How is it that maybe the trauma experiences that they went through in childhood may or may not have made them vulnerable to be more traumatized down the track, without the person feeling judged like, oh, you're trying to explain my UAP experience on my early trauma. So it needs a professional formulation that can integrate multiple different theories. And what I had before around those different kind of spheres in that model, that's an example how we'd approach that kind of intellectually. Somewhat legitimate to report sightings. This was another big issue, because there really wasn't anywhere. Yes, there's places like here, and there's places like Buffon and New Fork, and there's lots of places you could, in theory, report stuff to, but there's nowhere that's really pulling it all together, being super clear on what they do with that data. If you've first had if you get cancer, you can go onto cancer websites, find out about your cancer kind of treatments, where to go for help. You can find out by Samaritan's contacts and yada yada yada. But there's no one point of contact where you can go for vetted signposting for help. And some talked about wanting professionally run support groups of some sort of sort as well, which also makes sense. So they were the findings. So basically what I found is there are psychological and social effects to being exposed to UAP. The sources of support that are out there aren't appropriately professionally vetted. Like, as far as I know, there's no safeguarding training or practice on how to handle that, and how to make referrals in those kinds of sort of circumstances. So what do they potentially need? Well, they need clinicians that are knowledgeable about this area. They need clinicians that are capable of doing person-centered, non-judgmental engagement, which most health professionals should be able to do. It'd be good if there was external organisations that could collate and investigate cases, and external organisations that could be vetted that claim to help experiences in some way. Now, granted, there was only 4 participants, but that's the nature of qualitative work, which is different to the quantitative, which is I'll get in towards the second half. I don't know how real these experiences were. I can't prove that what they were telling me was beyond a shadow of a doubt, unless the military say, yeah, there was something flying over the top, and here it is on video, and they've got all the data. But that wasn't the point of the study. I didn't want to come at it trying to prove or disprove. I don't think I can do that. And it also wasn't a full assessment of their mental health. I didn't probe in all the ways that I could probe about their background and their memories and their experiences and their stresses and yada yada yada. Because again, I didn't want to push on that issue. I didn't have a need to that. I just wanted to kind of see what kind of came through. And so basically I've drafted it for publication. I'll see how it goes. 50% of academic stuff doesn't get published in the first place. The reviewers might come back and say they want double the amount of participants at least, or maybe 15 participants, and then I'll just have to kind of run it again and see how much the next lot of data conforms to that. But I I think I'd find similar stuff, and there are things that are published on just 4 patients, so we'll see. So what to do next? That's the next part of the talk. So we'll have a little bit of a break and then come back. Now, before a clinic is justified, so you can kind of sort of think, well, if there is somewhere that people could go, maybe we should create it. Now, maybe I need to do study 1 again, get more of an understanding of that. Maybe I need to develop an assessment tool for experiences to figure out how much has impacted them. So I've got some kind of metric that I can measure the impact, and that diagram is probably what I'll use as to start developing the items for a questionnaire, so I can measure the severity of negative impact of UAP and positive as well. Maybe we need to develop a professionally reviewed support website where we can start collating kind of vetted information. Maybe we need to have a treatment model, and that Rayburn article kind of sort of has an example of that, but we need to kind of revisit that. I also need to get the university fully on board. So I've had ethical approval to do what I've done, but it's kind of, there's sort of higher levels of ethic. It depends how much buy-in the university are happy to have around kind of this topic. I'm hoping that Cardiff Metropolitan University is a very progressive university, and I think this is an area of science. This is a scientific question. What are people experiencing, and what is it? And I think we need to have the freedom of thought, because if we don't, society kind of collapses if we don't. But having higher kind of ethical approval from kind of the board members and things like that isn't needed at this point in time. But if this becomes more and more public and we do more and more research, and hopefully we get funding at some point to do more, that'll be needed. So it depends how much appetite the university have for other people getting involved. I've networked with some other psychologists in the US who were willing to kind of work together, so there's potential. So let's have a 10-minute break so I can crack on the next bit, and I'll come back to the quantitative stuff. So thanks for staying for the second half. So this is going to be about study 2, and then I'm going to move on to a few other sort of topics as well. So, like I said, science really should be very small incremental steps. So study 1 was really me getting exposed to the data directly. So I've collected, I know what it is. So usually how science works is more, you look at what's done before and you take a little step, and then you take another little step. So the closest step to where I felt I could kind of go from a quantitative point of view, so qualitative is about interviews and the intricate kind of looking through, say, transcripts and qualitative information. Quantitative is about numbers, it's about statistics, and that's a different kind of approach. So there's one particular paper by Swami and colleagues in 2016 called Alien Psychology, I don't know why they've called it that, associations between extraterrestrial belief and paranormal ideation, superstitious beliefs and schizotypy. Now schizotypy is really a subset of a personality. It used to be a personality disorder category, but now it's basically the odd eccentric kind of style of thinking. It's not quite schizophrenia, where somebody might be hallucinating or having delusions. It's a lot milder form. It's not, so it's just a personality construct. And the big 5 personality factors, and I'll go through those a little later. So that was a published paper where they looked at some scales to sort of see what it predicted. Now, they measured there's an extraterrestrial belief scale that Swami and colleagues a few years before actually made, which is basically an assessment measure to find out how much somebody believes in visitation, how much somebody believes there should be scientific research, and there's a third category to it as well. But it's basically extraterrestrial belief. I don't know why it's called this, but it's the Australian sheep-goat scale. It's for measuring paranormal beliefs and experiences. They use the superstitious belief scale. They use the Oxford-Liverpool inventory of feelings and experiences. That was to measure schizotypy and psychosis, which is sort of abnormal perceptions and hallucination-prone dynamics. And the NEO, which was measuring the 5-factor model of personality. I'll explain what that is in a bit. Now, this research, you can kind of tell, was conducted with the status quo concept that belief in paranormal, superstitious, So people who believe in the paranormal, who are superstitious, high in that schizotypy personality trait, high in psychosis prone, and particularly people with certain kinds of personality characteristics would believe ET. So that's a long-winded of saying the crazy, strange believer is the UFO group. Now, that was almost the status quo hypothesis, where they've kind of measured these things and they want to see if those personality factors predict belief in extraterrestrials. So they had 433 participants, and they found, yes, it does. So people who believe in paranormal stuff are more likely to believe in extraterrestrials. People who are high in this schizotypy characteristic are more likely to believe it, but by about 5%. So these percentages are how much it accounts for the variance. So in statistical terms, you have the dependent variable, which is the belief in extraterrestrials, and think of it as a round pie chart, and then you cut that pie chart up onto how much of that pie chart explains belief in extraterrestrials from a statistical point of view. And so people who believe in paranormal beliefs, high in schizotypy, high in openness, which is a characteristic of personality, and who are less educated, are more likely to believe in extraterrestrials. And so that was their conclusion. And their conclusion was also that we need to understand what predicts why people believe in extraterrestrials. But with the variables they measured, that only accounted for 40% of the outcome, so it was only a small picture. Now, looking at it from a different point of view, in light of David Grush, in light of Lou Elizondo and all the things, the congressional hearings that have happened since 2016, you can kind of tell there's this unspoken academic kind of history where the judgmental status quo is that people who believe in ET are eccentric, poorly educated, highly open and agreeable people. So that was my starting point for some numbers around looking at this topic from a statistical point of view. But some of the problems with their study was that they looked at extraterrestrial belief, which that might not be the same as people who have actually seen things. So there might be a difference in that sort of population, that maybe very eccentric, gullible people believe in UFOs but have never seen anything. Maybe that's not the characteristic. So I kind of wanted to look at taking that study a next little sort of step. Does that actually apply to people who have actually seen stuff? Because they might not be, on average, gullible, uneducated people as the findings of the other one kind of found. But my constraints were I needed free measures. Some of them were measures that cost money, and I didn't have any funding. I needed witnesses, which they didn't have because they weren't looking at that. I needed as large a sample as I could kind of get, which is why I used it through Twitter. They had 400 odd, so I was trying to aim for that. I needed the smallest number of measures possible because that allows me to do the best kind of analysis with it. And I needed to replicate the dynamics of their study. So this is an example where you get previous work and you try and take it like an extra little step. So this was the design of the second study. So on the far left are the variables that I measured. So the big five, which are the big five personality factors. So all around the world, no matter what culture you're in, no matter what gender, whatever, you can be characterized on these 5 domains of personality. Neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. That's been well validated since the 50s. Those 5 personality variables, you can measure everyone around the world and will all score slightly differently, and they're very, very strong, good predictors of how you are as a person. And the other factor in there was the schizotypy, because I wanted to look at that as well. So you've got the big 5, which is essentially personality dynamics, and then schizotypy, which is a kind of odd personality dynamic. And I wanted to see how that predicts ratings on the extraterrestrial belief scale. So same as the Swami study, but I also wanted to ask, have you had a sighting? Because then I could compare people who have had sightings versus those that haven't had sightings. And I wanted to ask, what was it? But also, did you report it? Because I've never seen anybody find out how many people actually report. I know people like Richard Dolan say, oh, it's about 10%, or was it Stan Friedman used to do lectures and say, well, how many people have had a sighting? And half the people put their hands up and then say, well, leave your hand up if you've reported it somewhere, and that was only ever a small minority. So we kind of roughly know that most people aren't going to report it, but I just wanted to put some numbers to how many people actually report it. So what I found was that I had 206 full cases of data, so ones that weren't missing data, and I had to fix a few and yada, but I had 206 full cases that I released the questionnaire through Twitter, and 103, so exactly half, had UAP sightings. Now, people who have seen, so these were my results, so I won't go into the statistical analysis, I'll give you the key findings. People who have seen UFOs, UAPs, are higher on the personality variables of agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. And they're more likely to believe in ET visitation and the need for scientific research. Well, that second bit's obvious. If you've seen a UFO, you're going to think we should have more scientific research, and you're probably going to believe that we've been visited because you've seen something strange. But so like the Swami study, we did find that people who are more agreeable, conscientious, and open, which are good characteristics to have, are more likely to have seen a UAP than not. They're also more likely to be lower on neuroticism and the schizotypy subscale of social anxiety as well. They're less likely to be socially anxious. Now, the important thing you have to understand with statistics is how you interpret them. So these factors, so people who have seen UFOs were more agreeable, conscientious, open, and less neurotic and less socially anxious, but the effect size was small. Now what that means, in statistical terms, the top diagram, you've got the purple area. Now what I'm doing is I'm comparing one group, Group A, to Group B, so people who have seen UFOs to people who haven't seen UFOs. Now of a small effect size, the distributions overlap a lot. Now in the bottom picture, that's when the effect size is larger and those distributions do not overlap so much. Now the effect size is the important thing, because if you measure 1 billion people on whether or not drinking tea predicts cancer, you're probably going to find a significant effect. But the effect size will be infinitesimally small, which means that the finding is irrelevant. You're not interested in small, very small effect sizes. So basically, the personality factors that I found predict sightings were significant at the 0.001 level, which is there's a 99.99% chance that the results I had were not by chance. That's what probability testing is. But the effect sizes, they were almost all 0.1, which is very, very small. So what that means is that people who have seen UAP in my sample, I can't say for the world, but in my sample of 103 sort of people who have had sightings, they aren't really that much different from people who haven't had sightings. So unlike the Swami study, where we don't know if they had sightings or not, they were just people who believe in ET. But looking at comparing people who have seen UFOs to not UFOs by their own account, I don't know if it's true, but by their own account, on average, they're not that much different, which should be reassuring. And we should know that a lot of people we've met are pretty just average people. I've met social workers, I've people who work in prisons, and I've met secretaries, I've met lots of walks of life that I would just put in the average bag of being a human. Very few on the eccentric ends, which I don't know if that's been everyone else's experience, but that's so far been my experience. But there is a small subset of characteristic types that came out from the data. Now, my stats levels only go so far, so I've got a colleague in America who's helping me do some latent profile analysis, which will try and help us work out groupings within the data, basically. But I can already sort of see from the distributions, there are some people who are experiencers of UAP who are very credible, very sane, grounded experiences. They're very calm, very rational, they're not anxious, and they're very conscientious. So that's in the data. But a normal distribution, you've always got the fringes. And so some people are very high on those characteristics, but there's some people very low on those characteristics. So yes, some people who have experienced UAP are very bizarre, irrational, anxious, obstructive, and chaotic. And I'd call them the compromised and potentially insane experiencer. So versus the credibly sane, grounded experiencer, which you'd expect in a normal distribution of anything. Well, there's going to be massive variation. But most people were averagely normal on their personality variables, which is how the normal distribution works. But the same worked for the people who have not seen a UAP, there was a subgroup that were very anxious, irrational, and unconscientious. And I'd call them the scared debunker, people who just can't handle the possibility that there might be a non-human intelligence and the UAP might be real, and they just seem really anxious and irrational and unconscientious, not nice people. Then you've got the others that are very, very calm, rational, and conscientious. I call them the honest, curious, prosaic explainer. But most people were averagely normal. So I guess what I'm sort of saying is that people who see UFOs are not, based on my data, they're not that different in their personality structure. But the stereotypes that we have of the crazy believer, the scared debunker, and the really rational person and the really rational believer, that was in the data. There were some people that fit that arrangement. But the more interesting thing, so that was me trying to take a little step beyond the previous research. The more interesting things, to me at least, were I wanted to know, have you reported it somewhere? And I found that 29% of people reported it somewhere, but then when I ruled out social media, that went down to 14%. So, and that was usually to MUFON or the National UFO Centre. I think there might have been one Swansea one, but this was on Twitter around the world. So on average, it was MUFON and NUFON, but that was 14%. Now, I honestly don't know the answer to this, but does anybody know how many sightings get reported to MUFON and NUFON a year? Anybody? I don't. I honestly don't. So whatever it is, that's only 14%. Yeah, so that's just, I mean, I know Richard Dolan has said things like, there's like 1,000 a year that get reported to MUFON. Okay, so that 1,000 is 14% of 100% of sightings. So there really is lots and lots of sightings that don't get reported. Now, when I've talked just to people in general, most people didn't report their sighting anywhere. So it fully makes sense that most people don't report. But then the question is why? Why didn't you report it? And 28% said they didn't know where, 20% said stigma, 17% said didn't see the point, and others there was too small a number to have a category. Like they said they were too young, or they didn't realize it was anomalous, it was too fleeting, or they didn't have any evidence. So there's other reasons. So basically, I don't know of any other study that has shown that what gets reported is a massive fraction of what actually occurs as sightings. Now, if I had funding, I'd pick maybe say 20 locations around the UK that were randomly generated, and I'd go through every single house within a certain radius, and I'd randomly select of that radius which ones to pick, and that would give me a stratified sample. And that stratified sample, I would ask them all the question, have you seen a UFO, how many times, and provide the details. And that would give me a clear sighting per population and location kind of thing. But I need funding to do that. But from this little bit of data, it confirms what we know, which is almost nobody reports their sightings. And maybe that's because there's no way to report them that we feel confident in or feel useful. Now, what do they see? So we had 103 people. There was a total of 132 sightings across those people. So some had multiple sightings. The sightings, they didn't always put a date. I tried to just say, tell me about it. I wanted it really sort of basic. So they didn't all provide dates, but some of the dates that people spontaneously put in there was ranging from 1950 to last year. So it was quite a range of dates that came up. Now, what is interesting is that what they reported to see was very similar to the Pentagon statistics. So when surveying UFO Twitter, it was 30% saw star-like things, 26% saw orbs and spheres and plasma balls, 17% saw something uncharacterized. And this was something that I put in the other box. There was like one said that it was this woman that was changing her appearance and it floated off. Others it was shapes that were transforming, clouds that kind of moved into objects, and some were massive objects. So this is another box. 10% were triangles, 5% were discs, 3% were tic-tac, cigar tubes, 3% were cubes, and then there was just some other randoms like a cross, a pyramid, a donut, a boomerang. There was 4 beings mentioned. One was a grey, one was a 4-winged 8-inch ethereal being, one was a white creature, one was they just put a being. So again, the amount of sightings of beings is far less than the sightings of UAP in general. And again, so if only 14% of sightings get reported, I reckon it's probably maybe 14% of beings get reported of that 14%. So we've got no real clear idea of how many people are actually seeing actual entities of some sort. But the Pentagon stats were much the same. So they put 52% of an orb round sphere. And so if you add star-like and orb together, that's about 50%. Ambiguous sensor was 23%, so that's their other box. 1% triangle, I got 10%. They had 2% for discs, I had 5%, much the same. Tic-tac, 3%, that's what I get. Square, I had a few more cubes. They had others that were random lights. I put the lights ones in the uncharacterized box. The rectangle, I didn't get any rectangles, polygons, but they didn't get a donut or a boomerang. So that's what they're saying, military pilots. I assume the Pentagon stacks are military sources. Well, maybe they, I don't know. It's not like at the hearings they said, oh, this is where we got the information from, but the statistics provided at the second congressional hearing, they're the stats that they put up there and saying this is what they're seeing. And so in short, it's not that dissimilar from what I found. So yeah. So the overall findings of study 2 were that UAP witnesses aren't that different from this first study, from what I can tell from non-witnesses. Most sightings don't get reported. And there's lots of sighting variation, but what I found was similar to the arrow stuff. Now, the problems with that work was that there's nothing verified about their counts. I can't prove it, other than I have the data and I've got someone else is helping with the statistical analysis. I didn't screen for any other issues. I couldn't screen for mental health issues. It was just an online quantitative kind of measure. The schizotypy measure, I kicked myself because afterwards I realized I could have used a better measure for that, but hey ho. It was an adequate measure, but there are better ones I could have used. The NEO is a better way of assessing the Big Five than the free Big Five measure I used, but the free one is still good, it's just not as good. So, the reviewers, once I write up for publication, might say I should have used those. I would have liked a bigger sample, but I had sufficient power, which is the statistical language for I had enough participants to detect an effect if there was one. And I detected effects, and there was one, so that's not really an issue. I collected it via Twitter. Maybe I should have collected another group with people who know nothing about this topic and looked at those personality variables. Maybe, but that's kind of what the Swami project, the Swami paper did, and I found similar trends. Their effect sizes were pretty small as well, so I don't really need to do that again. So, but it was the first study that I'm aware of that looked at how often do people report and the personality of actual experiences. As far as we can tell by their own personal testimony. Now, this is, so that's the end of study 2. This is a separate little piece of work. I tasked a student with, said to him, tell me all the places we can report a UAP, and I want to see where they're the same. Now, the red is where they're not, and the green is where they are. So I know it's too small to see the writing from the back, but it's kind of like, got everything from Newfork to Bufora to MUFON to the sea UFOs to all the different ones that my student could find where on the internet at that point in time you could find, and the ones along the top are like the basics, the shape, the duration, the physical evidence, the number of craft, number of witnesses, characteristic, blah, 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 blah. So no one's collecting the same data. So how are we as scientists even meant to discuss the data or pool it together? I mean, I'm surely Jacques Vallée and stuff who have made databases have realized this problem. So we need to get together as scientists interested in this topic and agree on what needs to be collected. Because once we get that, we can at least have a standardized process where we can say, well, this is the information we need to kind of collect. And then we can make places to report that. And the data could be comparable. You could actually push it together rather than, okay, people take the basics, but a lot of the other stuff, like physical effects, there was only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 places that report physical effects, and 3, it looked a bit iffy, but they kind of tried. So that's a problem, because data is important, and how you collect that data is important, and then making sure what you collect is needed to be collected. Now, should you collect heaps of, I could have interviewed, in the first study, I could have interviewed them far more and done more thorough assessments on them, but it's not always ethically warranted to do that. They're not battery hens. You can't just interview people for days and days and days to get all what you want out of them. So you need a balance between what you're collecting and what you want to get out of it and what you hope to achieve. And so there needs to be an agreed upon balance around what we should be collecting, in my view. Now, so that's study 2, and I'll go on to future directions after that. So we've done a quantitative project, a qualitative project. Now I just want to talk a little bit more broadly around the psychological reasons for the truth embargo. Now I'm not saying we should not find out more about this, but I just want to provide a different frame of reference that you might not have thought of. So there's lots of reasons for why this whole topic, if true, has not come out that aren't to do with psychology. So it could be that the military wanted to make their own stuff out of it. They wanted to keep it secret for weapons. It could be the 1953 Robertson panel who said, "Can I keep it secret?" And that's kind of what they've done sort of since. It could be that it's so shocking that, like, what's the CIA guy that's saying it's DNA overlap? John Ramirez, like, he's saying that it could be DNA overlap and that's why they don't want to reveal it, or it's the abductions or manipulation of space-time or whatever. It could be legal. It could be that one company got access to it over another, and if they let that out, then there's lots of legal implications. It could be intellectual property disputes where they're saying, well, you gave it to me 80 years ago, what right do you have to take it back, and now we own it as a company because we've had it for so long, and why should we give it back and because it's been ours? So fair enough point. If they didn't sign up anything for an intellectual agreement, then that's a problem. David Grush has said there's crimes that have been committed in the context of this secrecy, and if true, that's a problem. Admitting that they haven't might mean that they don't know what to do with it and they've failed in trying to figure it out, and no one really likes to admit a failure. So maybe that's an issue. Maybe it's religious objection. So there's lots of non-psychology related reasons why they wouldn't want to talk about all this. But there are some psychological reasons why they wouldn't as well. The existential worldview threat, to realise we're not the top of the food chain, or might not be top of the food chain. Maybe they're scared of us, I don't know. But we assume that with the technology that they appear to be exhibiting, based on the testimony of people like David Grush and that, we're not the top of the food chain, and we've really got to figure out how we kind of come to terms with that. There's another area of psychological theory in relation to what's called terror management theory. So one of the ways we avoid the fear of death is we have a worldview. We've shown through many experimental studies that if you start questioning and loosening the threads of somebody's worldview and how they see the world, then death anxiety increases. We've even been able to subliminally prime messages that threaten one's worldview or that's against one's cultural background, and it increases unconscious reporting of death and conscious reporting of death anxiety. So we know that death and our fear of death is intricately linked to our self-esteem and our worldview through terror management theory. If you want to learn more about it, go look it up. So what does that mean for UAP? It means that if the UAP thing's true and that the secrecy is true and all those kind of things that we've been taught generally culturally aren't true, then it questions our worldview. Now, when our worldview is questioned, our fear of death increases. We know that for a fact. So it doesn't surprise me that people start fighting each other on UFO and Twitter over their point of view, because they need to defend their point of view so they don't feel so anxious about their little worldview and how they see the world, because it pops their sort of bubble. And this issue pops many of our bubbles. And when we talked about the experiences from the first study, many of them had that massive ontological shock. Their entire worldview was threatened. And it's not like all the encounters of seeing a UAP, it's out there in the sky. Why should one really actually be that frightened about it? There's no real threat there. It's why should it be any scarier than seeing a balloon? And it's like, well, it's the ontological shock of the existential worldview threat and the threat to our worldview, which activates a fear of death in all humans in some way, and that kind of comes out. The other issue is psychological effort. I mean, this is not an easy topic to think about. It often can be embarrassing when you try and talk about it with friends and people, and if you do study it, it's not easy. There's so many different points of view. It's so hard to kind of get your head around. I mean, if these things are moving like they're alleged to be moving, then it implies a manipulation of space-time and things that are just mind-blowing. It's just easier to go scrolling through Twitter or go watch Gogglebox or other stuff. There's a gazillion other things you can fill your life with that for that dopamine hit. And so some, it's too hard. They don't want to go there. It's not worth the effort. And it's like, if you had an unwell child, you'd probably go learn up about that condition, which you never would have done before. you have to have a reason to look into the things you're doing. Why would you make the psychological effort to look into a topic that on average most people don't pay attention to or aren't that interested in because they don't think it's real? Why would you go look into that for your own amusement? It's usually got to be something that worms its way in, some kind of experience. Now, I'm not an experiencer, so I don't have that excuse. I've just got the intellectual curiosity. So I guess I buck that trend, but most people don't want to put in an effort. Some people do, but once it grips you, then it takes hold. But the other thing about the psychological effort is that the helplessness and uncertainty can trigger fear and anxiety, and it can require a degree of courage and personal resilience to try and face it and figure it out, and to say, well, I don't know what this is, and to look at it. It's not easy. And all the philosophical questions that kind of come up, it's just maybe easier to not think about it. Now, for some people this applies, for some people it doesn't. I mean, when I've worked with people who have got cancer, and I've asked them, or they've been told they've got maybe weeks or months left to live, they just don't think about it. They're just like, I can't go there, don't want to know, whatever, it's going to be fine, and they just can't do it. It's called denial. It's too hard. And for some people, okay, fair enough, that's for them. But psychological effort is an issue. Stigma is another issue. I won't belay the point about that. Discrimination as well. You know, people apparently have lost jobs, like there's that classic case of the Japanese airline pilot who reports seeing a UAP and then he loses his job. You know, people have been bullied and ostracized because of that, and that's all psychological reasons why you wouldn't talk about it. There's some social psychology literature that also points why the truth embargo might be in place. There's lots and lots of evidence to show that human beings have a tendency for obedience to authority. There's lots and lots of experiments to prove this point. And if positions of authority tell us to do something, on average, we kind of do it. I know many of us don't, many of us can be quite rebellious, but the Morgannwg experiments sort of prove this point. Now, this was a guy in, I think it was about the late 50s, early 60s, and he set up an experiment in which you would, as a participant, would sit down and you were doing a training exercise where you would press a little electric zapper button if somebody spelt a word wrong. So you've got a person on one side and you have to press the button and they go zzzz. But in this experiment, the person getting the electric shock was pretending to get shocked. And there was another guy behind him in a big white lab coat saying, turn it up. And each time they got it wrong, they turned it up and they turned it up. Over 70% of people turned up the electrocution to killer levels, and the person is on the other side screaming their head off, pretending, but it was an actor pretending to be screaming their head off getting electrocuted. And most people push up the voltage when you've got somebody going, keep going, do it, bit higher, it's okay, it's safe, it doesn't hurt him. And that when you've got an authority figure, humans can be manipulated into doing practically anything. And that research came out of the whole Nazi kind of World War II kind of thing. They said, how can average people be sending people to death camps and stuff? And the Morgannwg experiments proved the power of obedience to authority. And let's face it, most authority figures and organizations in the world don't look into this stuff and have said it's not true for a long, long time. So we're going to have that tendency as a society. The Stanford prisoner experiments, this is one where they got a whole bunch of students. They said, well, you guys are going to be prisoners, pretend. You guys are going to be the guards, pretend. We'll put you in the cells and we're going to observe you for a week. And you're going to live and work as the pretend prisoners and the prison guards. They had to stop the experiment because they started harming the prisoners. You put anyone in that dynamic for long enough, and those in authority power end up slowly abusing it. And they've shown that that is the case experimentally. It's called the Stanford experiment, and that's what happens. So you've got people potentially in a position to know more about this UAP stuff, and us that don't have access to those classified things. You've got that power imbalance. So you mix the obedience to authority that humans have, plus this power imbalance, and it's a recipe for a psychological truth embargo, that we just pretend it's kind of not there, or we go along with the status quo. Obedience to conformity, so this is another area. So we've done experiments where we've shown that human beings have a tendency to conform. So if you get a bunch of lines, and one of them is shorter than the other lines, and you're sitting in a group of people, and the participant comes in, and the experiment is, are those lines the same length? And everyone says yes, because they're all actors. And they say, yes, it's the same. And what you find, again, 60-70% of people, when it's their turn to say, is that line the same length as the others? They go, yes. It's kind of like, if I say I'm a donkey, and every one of you say, am I a donkey? And each of you say yes, and it comes to my turn, I say, am I a donkey? Yes, I'm a donkey. Like, it's this tendency for human beings to conform to what the group is doing. Not everyone does. Some people buck the trend, but if everyone around you has a certain point of view, it impacts how human beings respond in those scenarios. And let's face it, the majority of people have not seen UAP, they don't believe in this stuff, and that is the world we are situated in. And it has to be something really powerful for you to have seen or experienced or to come across for you to jump camps into wanting to stay with this topic. So, the other thing is the opinions of people next to us have been shown in experiments where we know if you're going to sell something to you, we're better off telling you, instead of, this product is so amazing, it can do this, 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 and this, and they just shut the door on you because they don't want to know. They're better off if you want to sell something to someone, you say, well, your neighbour's got it, and your other neighbour's got it, and your mother-in-law's got it, they've all got it, you should have it too. And we know people buy stuff in that kind of context when the people next to them are doing the same thing. So we live in worlds where most people who haven't had a sighting live around people who haven't had sightings and don't look into this stuff. So the world that they live in is going to be influenced by that cultural kind of context and that conformity to the norm. We are in a time of fake news. I don't know what's real when I'm flicking through Twitter. So the other issue is if the lid is lifted worldwide around this stuff, is it going to be the Russians making heaps of fake UFO invasion videos and sticking it on our Twitter? So we're kind of like, oh my god, because we don't know what's real or not. We thought aliens were real and UAP and stuff ain't real, and whatever it is isn't real. And now if they tell us that it's real, how do we then just concern what is real and what's not real on the day of AI-fed social media illusions? Maybe that's a problem, maybe it's not. Now, here's a bit of a question, so finally a bit of interaction. Put your hand up if you've sometimes been a bit secretive about how you discuss UAP activity. Okay? Have any of you had views that are not in keeping with people who don't believe or this topic? Yeah? Have any of you felt agitated, annoyed, pissed off by those that don't believe in UAP? Okay? Have any of you had kind of struggled with your self-esteem, felt bullied, isolated, stressed in relation to this topic? Oh, okay. Have any of you gone through a difficult transition or time in your life after an encounter with a UAP? Few? Yeah, difficult times in your life, you've said, okay. How many people have had anger at the governments and the powers that be for how they've handled the UAP thing? Quite a few. How many of you have had withdrawals? How many have you had some degree of withdrawal from your non-UAP groups and friendships and more of an increase in UAP circles? I've got my hand up for all these, really. How many of you have, what you talk about is based on what others have told you about UAP? Can be completely, I've never seen one. How many of you have engaged in art or activities about UAP? How many of you have had possession of UAP literature? Okay. How many of you have had access to UAP websites and other social media related stuff in relation to UAP? Okay. I took these items directly from the signs that somebody is being indoctrinated into terrorism. So these are directly from the website for the things to look out for if somebody is being groomed for radicalization. Directly, like from the website. You took the signs that somebody is being radicalized, just change the word to UAP and put the word extremism. And that's what's on the government websites. So that's another thing we've got to think about. We're all kind of operating within a bubble that I've met many people who are happy to debate and discuss things and are very open and to sort of will challenge viewpoints. I'm not saying that you're gullible or that you are being groomed to extremism of UAP stuff, but we've just got to acknowledge that there's that risk there. because it's so captivating, it's so interesting, and it's potentially so profound and important. Of course, once you start getting interested, it kind of consumes your world. But we've also got to worry how much that feeds itself. And then when you add kind of personal conflicts and difficulties and how things easily blow up in that kind of context. So maybe it's an environment in which people could be manipulated because it's a relative minority group in the wider scheme of things. And that group, it's extremist view from people who are outside of this field. So something to bear in mind. But with all that said, what's some of the psychological reasons for transparency? Well, you might come up with more, but this is my idea, that the collective direction of humanity can only be decided by the knowledge of the humans that make up that population. End of. Yeah. It's like if I don't tell you you have cancer, you can't make decisions on your treatment. You can't make decisions on your life if you're not fully informed about what's going on. Now, will we ever be fully informed before we reach Nirvana? Probably not. And maybe you get to that state of oneness. You don't need to know because you know everything. I'm not saying that we have to know everything, because I don't think you ever will. Life is a journey of knowing more. It's never really the end. But we can't make decisions about stuff in our lives if we're not informed. Because I think there's no freedom without sufficient insight into an issue to make choices. End of. And I'd prefer to live in somewhere that's free, and I'd like to make my own choices about life. Where there is the other point, I think, is that why transparency is good, is that where there is adversity, resistance, difficulties, challenges, there is the potential for growth. End of. All the challenges in life, you should either, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Yeah, that whole Friedrich Nietzsche thing. And it's true. So maybe this issue, maybe if it came to light, whatever it is that needs to come to light or not, maybe we need to grow from it, maybe we need to understand. And I'm not talking in the enlightenment kind of concept, just that notion of how I understand myself, how, let's say somebody's had no exposure to this topic, then learns about this topic, and then let's say 6 months from now, we've had more congressional hearings and it's true in the general media and all that, then maybe they've got a lot of soul searching to do around how they face things. Maybe that's a good room. You can't grow unless there is some adversity. If you don't face any challenges or problems in life, there is no growth. So yeah, I think it's a good thing to grow. Because the only other alternative is to stagnate and die, and so that doesn't sound like fun, so you may as well face the adversity in life and grow. The other thing is that whatever this is might point the direction to what is possible. I'd love to go back to Oz instantly, getting a little flying saucer and kind of zup, or have energy that's kind of long-term powered if that's what they're using. So it really points to what could be possible if what they're saying is true. Maybe we could develop a productive relationship with the other. Some say there already is one. I have no idea. But it would make sense if something sent them here, or maybe they've always been here, whatever it is. I'd like a chat. And on my bucket list is if I get to do some therapy with an alien. Because do you know what? Or they could be a crypto-terrestrial, whatever non-human intelligence. If I get to do therapy with them, I think after them seeing what we do to each other, they're going to be really traumatized. I saw that man do that with a donkey. Oh, Jesus. Yeah, so I think maybe the non-human intelligence might need some therapy after all they've seen. And I'd love to provide that. Not that I feel like I could. I'm being facetious. So the other thing is, some people, if they want to continue thinking the Earth is flat and that there isn't non-human intelligence, well, it's up to them. I'm not saying that there is. I can't say that based on the data I've collected. But if we will go down that line, and if that's what it happens to be, then you make your choice. You want to stick your head in the sand? It's up to you. Life's like life's what you make it. We could also potentially, if we really continue to look at this, we might prove how it is all a mistake. How is this maybe just extremism playing out? Maybe the amount of people who see UAP are like 0.001% of the total global population, which statistically means that they are low chance probability events, which when you collect them out of 8 billion people, that looks like a lot of events, but maybe it's actually not that many events, and maybe they really can be explained prosaically. Don't know. Maybe if space-time is an illusion, as Donald Huffman kind of sort of says, then maybe what we're seeing is glitches in the space-time perception. It's not actually UFOs or anything. It's something else. It's just something beyond the goldfish bowl that we can't take our hat off and really see beyond the goldfish bowl. Don't know, but we sure need to look into it, because the implications, like I said on that signal detection theory, are really, really high either way, and we need to figure it out. And if we do figure it out in that way, if the, dare I say it, the Seagull Wests of the world manage to really prove beyond all doubt that all of this is an utter mistake, that would be such a major achievement of science, and a needed one. But that doesn't really interest me. So I've got other things to do, other problems to fish to fry if that's the case. I also think there are reasons for transparency is it would give legitimacy to help people negatively affected. Now, many people aren't. It's been a good experience for them, or it's been bad and it's eventually become good, but some people are. And it would be nice if there was transparency to say, yeah, this is a legitimate issue for some, and for some it might be a legitimate issue, but what they didn't see was UAP. And maybe they still need to be helped as well to understand maybe it's actually some trauma from earlier on, maybe it's sleep paralysis, maybe it's something else, maybe it's psychedelics, yada, yada, yada. And I think both groups need helping in that, because know thyself is really important, and understanding what things actually are. But that also leaves room for people who maybe have seen something that's really anomalous, that shook their world, or people who have had direct contact with whatever this stuff is. So I think they would help in that regard. Now, I've got a few more points before I round off. I wanted to briefly talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. So, in general, I don't like using diagnosis because no one actually fits into a box, and the categories in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual exist to make conditions billable by the American Psychiatric Association. They're not real they're real constructs, but they are constructs in every sense of that word. It's not like a table. I can't show you depression, but there are symptoms we kind of roughly agree on. There is depression, but depression is a word that describes a set of symptoms. I mean, it's just not as solid, but it's the same with quarks and things in physics. But so I'm going to say it's important, I think, not to own a diagnosis too much, just consider its cultural knowledge at this point of time with certain symptom characteristics as we understand it, because it will change over time. But with that in mind, how we understand post-traumatic stress disorder at this point, this is the criteria for the DSM. So you have, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So you have to have had exposure to a traumatic incident. You can also have it vicariously as well. But you've got to witness or confronted by an experience that was a serious injury or threat to life in some kind of way. So there has to be a threat to life, and it can be through vicarious, but that's a lot less common. You have to, not all of these symptoms, but I think 5 or more make up kind of the general sort of symptoms, but you have to have the first one. The other bits you have to have are a combination of the following, at least 2 from each of these following categories. So you have to have a re-experiencing of the trauma. So sometimes it's recalling recollections, sometimes it's dreams, sometimes it's acting or feeling as though it's happening again. So when I've worked with many abuse victims and I've seen them kind of disassociate, and it's like the abuse is happening to them again. Intense distress when exposed to internal or external cues that remind them of the trauma. So when I've been working with trauma and maybe they smell the aftershave, or they smell something that triggers it sort of for them. For others, the physical reactivity or hypervigilance or hyperarousal. So often after trauma, your autonomic nervous system just gets in a state of flux and tense, and it doesn't really kind of go away without kind of learning to rebalance that physiological arousal. So they're the categories in the re-experiencing trauma box. And then the other box is the avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma. So trying not to think about it, avoiding similar feelings associated or conversations with it, avoiding places, people, things that might trigger one's recollection. Parts of the trauma are missing. That is also very, very common. I'm not saying that's because of the aliens, that's just a natural part of trauma, because trauma memories don't embed themselves in long-term memory very well, because when you're that frightened, how you encode memories from short-term to long-term get affected. A feeling of detachment from others is often a symptom as well. You just don't feel like you fit in the world. Restricted affects, which is your emotions. Sometimes people are either one kind of emotion, or they're very sort of blunted in their emotions, or they can struggle to project themselves into the future. One of the common sort of effects of trauma is that they struggle to see tomorrow. It's like they sort of live in today, not as a euphoric engagement in life. It's just that they don't see themselves having a future after that traumatic experience. It's not because they practically think they're going to die. It seems to just disappear. They also tend to have an increased arousal of problems that were not present before the trauma. So problems with sleep, anger, difficulties concentrating, and an exaggerated or startled response. You have to have had it for longer than a month. It's got to disrupt your life in some kind of way. So many people have been through something traumatic and they have these symptoms, but they're able to get on with life. And technically that's not a disorder, because it has to impact with your life. But this is why I don't put too much stock in labels per se, because if you're affected and you can crack on with life, maybe you're resilient, but you're still suffering and maybe you still need help. That's why I say take it with a pinch of salt. Now, I won't go into the specifics. The secondary issues that people sometimes develop is depression, substance abuse, addictions, food, drugs, lots of different things, relationship breakdown. Now that's not symptoms of PTSD, that's secondary problems that can occur. And then the amplifiers is that we know that people with adverse childhood experiences, if they go off to war, are more likely to develop PTSD than those who haven't had adverse childhood experiences. So it seems like your developmental experiences shape your vulnerability to stuff down the track. And so you might have two people who, let's say, are abducted by a non-entity, and it's very likely that the one with adverse childhood experiences is more subjectively traumatized after than those that had a ideal childhood, should we say. That doesn't always apply. That's just a broad statistical rule that on average people with adverse childhood experiences are more compromised. But we know that people with adverse childhood experiences have a higher rate of cancer. We even know that grandchildren of the Holocaust are more likely to have health issues. It's an intergenerational kind of sort of dynamic across the lifespan. Those that have had repeated traumas are more likely to struggle with their trauma, and sometimes they call it complex PTSD when they've had repeated traumas and it's impacted them. And traumas that begin earlier in life. So I've worked with some kids with STDs at the age of 2, so it's kind of like some traumas when they begin earlier in life, that can have a more negative impact. So that's kind of what normal trauma looks like. And I'm not saying people here have been traumatized or not traumatized. I'm just trying to make you a little bit aware of what the red flags for somebody who might really be struggling. And there's some of the things I'd kind of look for. Whether or not this specifically applies in the context of people with UAP exposure and, say, abductions or whatever you want to call it, don't know. Research has not been done on that. We have not had enough experiences together that we've then officially diagnosed with PTSD using the official criteria, structured interviews and questionnaires to find out. But it would make sense that some apply. And when you listen to cases like Whitley Strieber and stuff, and I don't know if what he's saying is true or not, but when you listen to his accounts, you just think it meets some of that. So if any of those things kind of resonate with you, even just parts of it, I can't help you in the next 5 seconds, but I'll try and give you a little rundown of some of the general areas you can explore in mental health services that should be able to manage some of this, even if they're not that familiar with the UAP thing, and some private practitioners should be able to as well. So the helpful thing, if part of the symptom is avoidance, like anything you fear that you avoid gets worse. So a core treatment thing for PTSD is slow graded exposure to the things you fear. That's it. There's no other way of getting around that. You need to slowly gain mastery over the anxiety reaction. You've got to write about it, talk about it, maybe visiting the places. It's slow, small graded exposure back into really processing what happened. Avoidance only increases the problem. So what I have done with people often, they get to sort of write out their story in ever greater detail where possible. And usually when I've worked with ex-soldiers and stuff, it's kind of like we went here, we shot this, we did this, and it's very procedural. But then over the course of therapy, it's much more, this is how I felt in my body, this is what I remember, and they can get to integrate those emotions and sensations, which kind of allows them to eventually sort of put it to rest. The other thing is there's a really good book called The Body Keeps the Score, and there's lots of good evidence to say that trauma is held in the body. So often when sometimes people can't talk about their trauma, it's about using diet, exercise, maybe cold water, maybe Wim Hof breathing, but yoga, massage, relaxation, exercise, martial arts, use the body, or creatively write, draw, get out creative things. Sometimes we do have more connections going from our gut and our heart to our brain than we do from our brain the other way down. And so our body has this intrinsic memory system that trauma is stored in, because it's linked to the brainstem, which is the oldest parts of the brain. So all those what sound like new age hippie kind of things are actually potentially useful for many people, particularly when they can't get out the content of the trauma, is kind of look after your body, because the mind and the body are just one system. So look after the body and the mind becomes better. Understanding and exploring within appropriate service, ideally, the difference and overlap between one's developmental trauma and one's PTSD, because maybe they've had a rough childhood and that needs to be understood, and so does their PTSD. Sometimes it's useful to explore that the anger can be a mask for the anxiety, and the anxiety masks the shame and the guilt underneath it. So usually sometimes you might find, like when I work with rape victims and they are really angry, really aggressive, acting out, usually under that they're really frightened. And then when you explore that, it's, it was my fault, I shouldn't have worn that, I shouldn't have been there. And there's this sense of shame and guilt. Once you deal with the shame, the guilt, the anxiety and the anger sort of relieves itself. So that's what I mean about having a person-centered, unique formulation for the constellation of emotions and how you pull them apart with somebody to explore what's really driving the difficult emotion. Medications are only short-term. All anxiety disorders, whether it's panic disorder, agoraphobia, social anxiety, medications should only be short-term, because you need to deal with it psychologically. It's not like some things like many psychosis is helped with medication, so is many bipolar, and other things are helped with medication. And you can use medication to help with anxiety, but it should only be short-term. Then there's addressing the secondary issues. If you've got depression or addictions or relationship breakdowns or sleep, that all needs dealing with as well. It can be helpful to seek out other people who have been affected by similar things. And it's also really important to think about the emotional integration is key to dealing with any traumatic, anxiety-provoking thing, because it is not what happened to you, it's what happened inside yourself that becomes the trauma, it becomes the wound. And what happened inside yourself for anything traumatic is that your emotions become separated out to survive the situation. It's like your brain shuts off the emotional bit to survive the bad experience, or the experience is so overwhelming that you can't lay it down in your longer term memory and put it to ease. And so actually it's about connecting back with the body, connecting back with that experience, and putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. There is growing research around EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization. So that's a process of using eye movements that actually, we don't understand how it works, but it works in a good chunk of people. That moving the eyes in a particular manner can help kind of, when they're talking about the trauma and doing these eye movements, it seems to move it from short-term into long-term memory to the point where the emotional pain of the memory seems to really subside. And I've seen cases with one session of EMDR and their trauma is gone. So it is possible. There's growing research into psychedelics. I'm not an expert into that, but there's definitely the use of controlled trials where they're using psychedelics to help people deal with trauma. Because psychedelics basically is like getting a snow globe to your brain, and when the dust settles again, the anxiety responses aren't the same. I'm not saying go out and do mushrooms. I'm just saying there's research out there that exists in that direction. And the other thing to recognize with trauma is sometimes the flinch response or the fear response that happens may never go, but the balance of regaining calm can become quicker. Your hobbies are really important. Learning to say no to things you don't want to do in life is really important. And ideally becoming a better parent to yourself. And I guess what I mean by that is that many of you probably have kids, and you're probably kinder to your kids than you are yourself. And the kind things and supportive things you do for your kids is probably what you need to do for yourself. And so it's a good model to kind of consider, what do you actually need? And it's, well, what would you provide as in a loving, caring relationship to your kid is probably the hint to what you need for yourself. And the not so useful stuff is avoidance, addictions, trying too hard to remember. The brain can easily make up false stuff. You don't need to push it. Too much focus on trauma. Sometimes you can get obsessed about a topic, and that's not always good. It's sometimes to be boundaried like you would with an annoying child or difficult neighbour. Give it times to be heard. Ignoring some of the precursors that lead up to these problems is an issue. Pressuring yourself to have all the symptoms gone is an issue as well, because life's a roller coaster. Emotions and dealing with it, you've got to let things unfold in their own natural way. Sometimes it's, I shouldn't be feeling this. That just actually makes things worse. The other thing is when you're tired and stressed, the symptoms that you've conquered long ago will come back. It's just the nature of being human. And the water runs back into the well. So it's kind of like sometimes you've got to revisit issues across the lifespan. And cutting yourself off from others isn't good, so spend time with friends. Okay, so future directions. I won't keep you too much longer. So where is all that? So I tried to provide a little bit of PTSD kind of treatment overview. So just to say, if you are feeling traumatized or affected by this stuff, it can be addressed and get help. So where do I go with this? The short answer is I don't know, but I have a list of areas that I'd like to go. This isn't in any particular order. This is just sort of down the layers of scientific understanding. So in my field, we need lots more systematic reviews and updates on all the terrestrial human-based explanations that get mistaken for the phenomenon. We need that spelled out in black and white because people have talked about it, there's different bits of research, but we need to bring all the literature together and say, what else can this be in a systematic kind of way? And so we can tick off looking for all those things in cases coming forward. I'm not interested in that research because there's better people to do that than me. Next, I think, is what level of general knowledge do the public have about this issue? We need to measure that regularly and see how that changes over time. I think we need to have a systematic review protocol for looking at all historical cases and future cases. And that's why that chart that I had of the data that we collect is so important. We need agreed upon criteria so we can trawl through all the past stuff and kind of grade it in a systematic, methodologically sound way. And then cases coming forward, we can actually have a decent way of assessing. I think maybe we need to have psychological interventions at the policy level to think about what is safe disclosure. I'd really love to know what is the full extent of what we know and what we don't know, because then we should have at least a science-based peer-reviewed process on how a disclosure process should unfold. I mean, they've got stuff in place for if there is a nuclear bomb coming, here's a protocol of what needs to be done, and I assume that's been developed by people who have actually thought about it. So what is it about this topic and what is a safe disclosure process? Should we just tell it, should they release everything or should they not? And I think science needs to be involved in that discussion. Developing public policy on how there can be reconciliation with the government or governments. I mean, Ross Goldhart's kind of talked about that a little bit already. I think we need to establish scientifically robust assessments for authentic reporting. I'm convinced if this issue continues to gain traction in the public media, there's going to be people saying, I crashed my car because of a UFO, or I did the rape because a UFO told me to. How do we assess those cases in a court? Don't know. I mean, we do it enough for rape cases and other stuff, so there's lots of literature we can draw on, and I've used lots of structured professional judgments in my clinical work, and I've drafted out an assessment tool we could use, but that's early stages in the making, because I think it's going to be needed in the courts one day. Or let's say your wife doesn't believe you about the abduction experiences and she doesn't think you're safe with the kids and she wants full custody of the kids. How do you go to the lawyers and then say, here's my mental health record, but where's the psychological assessment done in a robust way to say, look, on the balance of probabilities based on his testimony and what we know from the systematic reviews, this person looks like they're not lying and is safe. There's no assessment for that at the moment. I think one needs to be created soon. Then it's about how do we assess the psychological needs of experiences? How do we measure distress? And I think I talked about that before in relation to that map that I had before. Then we need to develop treatments, and the guys in France have pointed a little way on how we could kind of do that. But part of the reason I'm reluctant to start up my own clinic right now is not just because of the practicalities, but it's also by what practice am I engaging in an accountable way? I'd just be winging it and seeing where it kind of goes. And so I need to do that. If I'm going to do that, I need to see experiences in the context of a research project where I've got ethical approval to record everything. I can have others look about how I do things, because otherwise it's an utter free-for-all. So by what treatment protocol would we be treating experiences, and how? Don't know, but we need to create a structure to at least start that process of making treatment approaches. We need further investigations into all of the topics related to the phenomenon, whether it's kind of character mutilations or all the paranormal stuff. I don't want to put a limit on what does and doesn't interact, what fits into this box, because I don't know. But the whole box, because it seems like the paranormal bag comes along with this box, and we need to look into that as well. So, and parapsychology is actually pretty good for that so far. There's lots of literature on understanding the parapsychology stuff. Then maybe we need to think about, how do we reduce speciesism and prejudice against these non-human intelligences? Like, is that an issue? I mean, we struggle enough with racism within the human race, so let alone speciesism. I mean, is it going to be a District 9 situation? Don't know, but maybe that needs to be thought of. Then also we need to develop an understanding of the psychology, if that's the right word, for non-human intelligence. How do they think? What do they think, and how do they think, and how do their processes of cognition, if any of that's the right word for them, I don't know. But there's some of the global areas of research that I think the field of psychology needs to kind of go. I'm not saying I'm the person to do it, I'm just saying I'm trying to ask the questions and see who wants to pick them up. So my rough plans are, I don't know really where to go. Teaching's over for the year, I've done one marking, so now I'm in the process of figuring out which projects to do for the next year. I might have to do the case study one again so I can have a bigger sample. I might see if I can do the quantitative project I did in other countries, because I've got a few other links through our university network to do them there. I've had the okay from James Fox to use his documentary to, because you need permission to show documentaries. Now what I'd like to do is get good documentaries and show them to people who have heard nothing about this area. And I want to measure the psychological impact. Do they get anxious? Do they not? Do they get depressed? Do they get shocked? Do they care? I think you're going to find a range of reactions, and I'm kind of interested. This question: can we, as in the human race, handle disclosure? Don't know. We need to maybe start exposing people to stuff and measure before and afterwards, monitor it. Maybe there's some really fragile people who can't handle it. Maybe we need to safeguard some of those. I mean, you can't watch something on the BBC without saying, if this has affected you, please. So caring for people is important. But when it comes to this topic, maybe we also need to start measuring how it impacts people. Because it might not. Maybe on average it doesn't. People are so desensitized to war and other things. Maybe we'll be fine. Don't know. But we need to find out. And so I'm thinking of doing a project on that. Part of the reason I don't know where to go is because this stuff's unfolding really fast. I mean, if you told me 2 months ago, I would have been really confident on doing the exposure to documentary study. But I mean, if in a month's time we're doing a third congressional hearing that, if as is starting to be rumoured, there's people like David Grush giving far more testimony. I mean, this stuff might blow up to the point where there's no point me showing them documentaries because they've already been exposed to it all. And it took me a year to get to the point where we've got ethics approval, found participants, written it up, and so I don't want to design something now that in a month's time is completely pointless, because it's going to take me a year through going through students and getting it all done in the first place. So I need to think things that are maybe more longer term. The impact of assessment tool, maybe I might work on that. I might continue to develop my psychological assessment measure for the credibility of a witness. And I've got links to the Durham University, where one of the lawyers there was talking about working together to see if we could kind of make that happen. I'd like to begin a small clinic of treating people who report being genuinely affected, and I'll videotape it all and kind of do the clinical skills from all the different angles that I have to try and help them and navigate that journey. But I don't know if now's the right time to do it. It might not be. We'll sort of see. Depends if the university want to do it, if they'll let me do it, to what extent, don't know. So it's all in the early stages, but I'd like to head in that direction. So I've got some brainstorming to do over the summer and take it from there. So I covered a bunch of stuff. So any questions, but they've got to be people who didn't ask questions last month. because I want to hear from the people who don't usually ask questions. But I can't remember who did ask questions last time, so maybe he did, but if you guys know who did last time, so. Yeah, all right. So,
Going back to your group who may have thought they were abducted or had dreams of being abducted and had physical, have you thought about what makes them, that group of people, common? Are there other aspects that ties that together?
mm-hmm.
So let me throw in a couple of things. They got red hair.
Mm-hmm.
Have you looked at their blood group? Do they have O blood group?
Mm-hmm. So you're kind of wondering, have I thought about what common characteristics abductees, let's call just that category, might have? I've thought about it. I have no data that can speak to that. There's probably stuff out there I haven't read that's relevant. Now, the only thing that comes to mind right now is that maybe Gary Nolan's right with the caudate putamen being the antenna in the brain. That's more likely than the red hair. I know you were just using that as an example. If anything, that might be right, where the caudate putamen is a part of the brain that may act as an antenna and makes them more vulnerable to seeing more bizarre, more outer space-time stuff, paranormal, UFO, don't know, mediums, whatever, just that. So maybe it's that part of the brain. And maybe once they've seen it, it makes them more likely.
I'll throw something at you that you may have read about. The O blood group is a reptiloid type blood group. And you might have heard of hybridization program. People have said that the ETs find it far easier to hybridize with humans who have that O blood group. And that's why those type of people are abducted more than others. And furthermore, those type of people have a higher vibration, even though they may not know it, which makes it easier for them to transport them onto the craft. Now,
So,
you know, this is stuff that I've researched. I'm not saying it's true, but when you get certain information, it fits together. It's a big jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, I'd agree that it is a big jigsaw puzzle trying to figure out. I guess my issue is that I don't know, certainly from the data that I've collected, that I could say any of those things. And what this experience and studying this stuff has taught me is I don't want to ever have the hubris and arrogance to think that that could not be possible, and that is not the case. So from a scientific point of view, I think the right thing is just put it on the table, let's figure out how to collect the data, and the truth will out in the data. So maybe the stuff you mentioned about O types of blood and stuff, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. I don't know. But should we look into it? Yeah, I think, we should probably look into all of this, but look into it with a methodology that's repeatable and shareable. Maybe people have already done that, and I haven't come across that literature, but I suppose the point is that we should have the freedom to ask those questions to explore.
Just one thing. You cannot just look at the literature. Because there may be those that don't want any of this information out there, therefore you will not be able to publish it.
Yeah, I suppose change that word from literature to any means available. If the aliens or ETs telling us directly, if the experiences are telling us directly, any source of information, I'm trying not to have any arrogance or hubris that I need to discount anything.
I would also say that I know it's a maze, the information outside the main media, when you've got all this YouTube, Rumble, BitChute, but the information is there, the truth is there, jumbled up with lies and psyops, and it's when you've got to dig through that in a way, who's the truthers and who's the liars. At some stage, some people believe this is the truth and these are the people you can believe, and the rest are,
And if I have a God, it would be the scientific method, truth will out eventually, if we ask the right questions and collect the right data. Any other questions or thoughts? Or I can't see. Hello.
Hello, sorry. A bit cheeky, two questions. Just quickly. Firstly, given the chronic underfunding of mental health support, do you worry that there may be a risk if you were to set up a clinic that you would attract people who don't honestly believe they've had a UAP but are desperate for help and support?
Yeah.
And secondly, just quickly, as a psychologist, what is your opinion, views about using regressive hypnosis to support experiences?
So I guess to the first question, if I opened up a clinic to see abductees, am I just going to mop up heaps of people that just can't get help elsewhere and don't really have a UAP issue? Absolutely, we need to think through these things, and that might be part of the reason why we don't go ahead with it. If I accepted referrals, one idea would be that I'd need at least a letter from the GP that of their degree of credibility and they've sourced help elsewhere, like they don't have a clear alcohol addiction that I just wouldn't be able to manage in a service by myself, sort of thing. And so they need to have checked those out. I almost need confirmation from a GP or a health professional, social worker, or someone that sort of vouches for, I really think this person needs help and it's really about this specific issue. So like working in cancer and palliative care, I can only see them if they've got cancer or a palliative diagnosis. Some people are going to die of the condition that they have, but it's not cancer and they're not yet palliative, so I can't see them. And so it would have to be some kind of assessment like that. And if I had a proper assessment protocol for credible witnesses that would stand up in court, that would include doing assessment on those people and then being like, this really isn't a UAP issue and I'm sending them off elsewhere, kind of thing. But the second part of your question was something to do with, do I rate regressive hypnosis and all that kind of stuff? Yeah. Almost no, there's only one psychologist I've come across in all these years of practicing that even knows how to do hypnosis. So psychologists these days aren't trained to do hypnosis unless they especially kind of go out and do it. There is lots of evidence that it can lead to false memories, and that is a problem. If I ever was to use hypnosis with a patient, I'd probably want to have them be a clinician that I vet and trust. And then we film it so I know exactly if they'll ask leading questions. I can make sure that I've got evidence of how they handled it. At this stage, I wouldn't recommend it because I don't know who I'm recommending to send it to because it's not a standard thing in the NHS. But I've seen people with open stomach surgery with no anaesthetic under hypnosis. So, like, it does have a massive power. Yes. And even if somebody, like, I've even had people who have been off to war, done horrible things, they've got the accurate records of what happened, and still the memory is not really what happened. Like, a memory is a construction of the past fragmented together. So I never believe that anybody's memory, including my own, is an accurate reflection of what went on. And you don't need to. It's just, it can have the general gist, but sometimes it can be make or break for an issue. Yeah?
Sorry, if you did open a clinic, would that be classed as victim support or abnormal psychology?
Don't know. And whether it should be abnormal, like you've got a problem that's come to a clinic, versus maybe how do we help support? You know, like this is all this sort of like, oh, we need to get rid of mental health illness. Well, what about mental wellness? Like, so could there be ways that we could improve their mental health that isn't just the presupposition you're already suffering and we want you to suffer less? It might be you're doing fine, but how do we help you flourish in this kind of context? So again, it's in the embryonic stage of an idea, and there's just lots of hurdles to kind of go through. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah?
Yes.
No, he had his hand up first. He beat you.
I thought it was a brilliant talk.
Thank you.
Very timely, and somebody with your credentials taking this seriously in terms of serious research, I think it's a brilliant thing. You said earlier on about...
No. Oh, thank you. I'm trying.
It's brilliant. You said earlier on about you saw Bob Lazar documentary or something.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything else in your life that kind of triggered your interest? Was there any paranormal stuff? Was there any stuff that happened in your life?
There was no paranormal stuff. No, I mean, the closest I've had to sightings, I'm pretty sure I saw a bird that looked like a ball, but it was a long way away. And I did see a red light above my car once, but it was, I was at the traffic lights, I didn't have a proper look at it. So I really don't have any personal UAP experiences that I actually feel was a UAP experience. I mean, there's been big revelations in my personal family about my background and my life that I only knew early on in adulthood, or in late adulthood, only a couple of years ago. I won't go into details about that because I know it's being recorded, it's public, and I'm not sure if I want everyone to know the details of my sordid personal life. But all what I can reveal is that it was an issue in which there was a time before knowing issue X, and there was a time after knowing issue X. And so I do have a passion for, it is important to know the truth about oneself, to empower oneself to make decisions about one's life. And so there is a part of me that empathizes with this issue in general, and is a bit of a driving factor, because I think many people have seen something and it's been quite, oh my God, there's life before and life afterwards. And very much like I see with people who get cancer, there's life before your diagnosis and life after it. And so there are elements of my personal life that resonate with me with this issue, but some might say, well, that's a synchronicity, it's a life event that gives me a passion for this, or it could just be coincidence, or it could be that what we call in the trade countertransference, where I'm addressing my other issue by feeling like I'm trying to be a savior in this other issue, and really I'm just acting out my fantasies of my own issues. I'm a psychologist, I'm meant to overanalyze things. I mean, I've thought about those kind of other ulterior motives I may have, but the answer to why we do anything is always 10, 15 odd answers, depending on the theory you apply to it. So the answer to your question, is it? Yes, there's been things in my personal life that have led me down this sort of track, but I've got no real reason to justify that it's anything particularly paranormal other than life happening. And I'm fully open to it. It could be maybe some non-human thing has directed my life, but yeah, it's not something I can feel confident with. But I'm open to the possibility. Just, I'm not, yeah. Does that answer the question in an honest way?
Thank you. You need to keep an eye on looking in the skies in Llandaff. There's plenty going on.
I do look at the skies a lot more than I used to. In the experiences that I've met, they tend to flinch at the sky a lot, which is that hypervigilance, and that I've sort of noticed. I think you had a question next, and then you.
Yeah, just briefly. I'd just like to reiterate what that gentleman said about the talk. It's been a fantastic talk.
No, appreciate it.
And what you're doing is absolutely marvellous. But the point I'd like to get across to you is, do you feel that you're going to be obstructed in initiating what you're trying to?
Naturally, I'm scared about, say, reputation and blowback. I think it's been taken seriously enough in the Congress. I've got some clout to argue that maybe we should look at this. I mean, the US Congress is looking at it pretty seriously. I think I should as well. This forms a part of other work I do into county lines and other research projects and with the NHS and blah, 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 blah. This is only one subset of the projects I'm kind of on. So I'm trying not to let it dominate my profile just for now. But if it happens to over time, great. I'm sort of losing the thread in my head of the rest of you. Do you think I'm going to be obstructed? I don't see the university might. I mean, there might be those in the university that say they don't want their academics tackling this topic. I have not had that resistance yet from the people I've talked to. It's been a great university to me. I 100% kind of recommend Cardiff Met. The people there I work with is fab, and the valuing the scientific endeavour is the whole point of having a university, is to increase knowledge. So I can't, because if I find out this is all bollocks, great, scientific discovery, amazing. If I find out this is all true, amazing, scientific discovery. There's no way, no direction this topic can take that isn't of interest to the field of science. And I feel under that rubric, if people do have resistance, just point out the methods. What have I done wrong? I'll do it better next time. Yeah, and I still at this stage am naive enough potentially to believe in the faith of science and power of that over time, and that collectively we all kind of hope to head in that direction. But maybe someone will put a spanner in the works. I don't know, maybe somebody might see this and go, we can't have him talking about that. I don't know. I mean, there's some pretty high level people in the Congress talking about it. And I think for me, once Louis Elizondo came out and I saw some of the stuff he had to say, I was like, I don't think he's lying. Like, is his memory 100% accurate? No, because no one's is. But he's got some things to say that sound pretty important, that were pretty convincing to me, that it's being taken seriously. And if so, that's pretty interesting. Yeah? Are you got a question?
There's 3 points.
I've got a small memory, so try one at a time.
There's been plenty of documented cases of look at our, in this country is Rendlesham Forest, where John Burroughs has won his case in court, and that's one. And there's been documented cases of ladies being pregnant, having no partners, and then the fetus has disappeared after 3 months. And the fact that we're all here is one thing. I think we ought to get over the fact it is real, it's here, and it's interacting with human society.
And all those things are fascinating. And following your third point, I guess, watching the Graham Hancock stuff on Netflix about the ancient civilizations and stuff, that's kind of like, wow, that before 10,000 years ago, and the Younger Dryas Comet and all that kind of stuff, that maybe they have been here for ages and forever and before. I'm open up to that possibility. I have no data that supports that, but I have nothing really to refute it. But I'm open up to those sort of possibilities. I mean, about the women being pregnant without partners and stuff like that, my issue with that is really I haven't collected the data. And I go like this because it's my baby when it's my data, and I analyse it. And it's like I know what it is then, and I know where it's come from in that chain of custody. And I'm not saying that people who have investigated those cases with phantom pregnancies aren't true, but it's I haven't done the data, and I'd like to.
Just one point though, I mean, there's a hell of a lot of people throughout the world believe that Mother Mary got pregnant.
Yeah. The three wise men following the stars and stuff that move along. I mean, it
believable, is it not?
it makes simple sense to me that a lot of the religious histories have been intertwined with this topic. Yeah. That's been an accusation that's been put out there. I mean, this topic is on the fringe by nature and is bizarre by nature because it's not the mainstream. And so therefore, if we've become, like in the last 3 years, I've moved from somebody who doesn't even think ghosts are real and the soul is real. I just think, when we die of flesh, that's it, and there is no soul, there is nothing beyond this existence that we experience. To somebody who's going, geez, I really don't know. So it's kind of like the things you talked about, I put in the, yeah, let's look at it. Let's have legitimate ways of where people can report their accounts, and let's find out how many people have had a phantom pregnancy in those kinds of circumstances, and then let's interview as many of them as we can. Let's collect as much data that we can from their biologically, physically, and do it in a methodologically sound kind of way.
And I commend you for looking at this.
But hopefully no pressure. I don't know if I can make all this stuff happen. It's just that I advocate that the people within the realms of science and the different disciplines need to start looking at it. As the Rendlesham Forest one, that's another incredible kind of case that I would like, if the military want to pay me to send their military witnesses to me and have confidential conversations, and I can treat them and hear first-hand accounts in that kind of way, great. I'd love to be doing therapy with David Fravor and all that, or the people of that kind of caliber that have been through those sort of things. But I guess it's sort of, again, I'm still warming myself up to collecting my own little data of chain of custody, and as it moves on, I can network with others that can do the same. And so I've got a few colleagues I know in California State University who are really keen on this topic as well, and so hopefully we can do it on sort of both sides of the pond. And my university has another separate campus in Sri Lanka and Greece, and hopefully if it gets enough traction and if this goes up enough in the media, I might be able to convince those other campuses to copy work that we're doing here, so we've got multi-site stuff kind of collecting. But
America is far more ahead of Britain.
yeah, but whether or not they are on sightings and stuff, we just don't know until you randomly... Oh yeah, research and stuff, it sounds like they are, but I don't know. I mean, it's like I said about that point of extremism. You know, I don't know what I'm being fed and how to really filter that. I'm trying to filter that, but at the same time, it's kind of like I know that my little data projects where I've kind of got, I know where that filter is, and then I can build on that, hopefully, over time.
A lot of people here have been into this subject many, many years. So,
Then there's a collective wisdom of people. And I've tried my best to listen to people who have been there and done it before myself for a lot longer, and because there is a wisdom in the experience of it all that I don't have. Yeah.
Okay, well, unfortunately, I think we'll have to close it. It's 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'd like to echo those points as well that a few have made. We're living through very interesting times, aren't we? And mainstream science is coming on board.
Trying.
So,
Thank you.
give him another round of
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And it's equally amazing that he's actually living in Wales as well.
I can't go back to Australia. My wife won't let me.
We don't want to go back to Australia. Right.